Hello everyone. Hello Paul. So we'll start shortly. I will say a few words about the pleasure we have to receive Paul Ferraro today. So Paul is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He's also director of EPIC, the Environmental Program at Innovations Collaborative, and director of the CBER, the Center for Behavioral and Experimental Environmental Research. And recently, he's a member of the EPA Evidence-Based Compliance Assurance Working Group. Paul develops evidence-based programs to solve society's big issues, and today he makes a talk about the power of social experiments in designing public policies. Paul, you have a bit less than 1 hour, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Julie. It's great to be here, and I wish I could be in where you are rather than where I am, but this will have to do. I just want to confirm, you said I have an hour. Is that an hour that you want me to talk, or an hour total including questions?
It's less than an hour, so that we keep something like 20 minutes for discussion afterwards. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, so 55 minutes of me talking, yes? Roughly. Okay. All right. Great. So the other thing I want to confirm is, how do I get my slides to start? There we go. All right, let me just confirm that I can advance them. All right, that's not going to work. How about this? No, let me click on it and see if that helps. Oops, there we go. No. All right. Oh, so those are not my most recent slides. Those are the slides I sent yesterday. That's okay. I'll just use these. These are close enough to the final slides. Okay. So as Julie said, I want to talk about social experiments. And what I mean by that is collaborations of academics or researchers and policymakers to jointly design and implement experiments inside of actual programs. And I'm focusing on agricultural or agro-environmental programs today. I want to start with a story that's not about agriculture, but I think is instructive of why we do these experiments. So in the US, most charities call first-time donors to thank them for their contributions, because the charities believe that a personal thank you increases the likelihood and amount of subsequent or second donations. And most charities do this, and those that don't wish they could, but it's relatively expensive to do. Julie, can I ask you something? These are old slides. I think these might be the ones that I sent sometime much earlier. Is it possible I can upload new slides, or is that going to be too difficult?
Yes, you can.
Okay, let me try to do that. So I apologize for having to do this now, but it shouldn't take long since we did it yesterday and we know how to do it. So there, it's uploading. I just assumed I would be able to do it before we talked, so I apologize. Yeah, this is from yesterday morning when we just did a practice, the previous slides, which are not the ones that I finalized yesterday.
That we use this technology, so
yeah, no problem. So it's still processing, but yesterday it didn't take very long for it to upload. And we still have plenty of time. So while I'm waiting for it to upload, let me just continue the conversation on this example. We don't need slides for it. I mean, it's very obvious in all human societies that saying thank you is an appropriate gesture because it encourages reciprocity. Right? So the charities in the US do this. They call to do a personal touch, a personal thank you, because they think it's obvious that it encourages subsequent donations. And they base that on their own experience and talking to people who say they appreciate being told thank you, and it makes them feel more connected, more linked to the charity, and more likely to give them donations. So survey evidence and field evidence suggests it helps. But recently, a researcher was able to convince 70 charitable organizations to test this idea. Because again, it's expensive. It doesn't work as well as people think. Then we'd want to be doing something else. All right, great. Can you see the slides? Yeah, great. All right. So they agreed to randomly select 10% of their first-time donors and did not call them to say thank you, right? So they're already doing this in their operations. They agreed to select at random 10% of their first-time donors and didn't call to say thank you. They worked with researchers to design and analyze the experiment. So it was a partnership between researchers and the nonprofit organizations. They ran it for a few years. And what they saw is in the no-call group, so this is the 10% that didn't get a thank you, 28% of them donated a second time. I know this is coming from a paper by Samick and Longfield. Samick is an academic researcher and Longfield is a practitioner who works for philanthropic or charitable organizations. And cleverly, they went to 200 fundraising professionals. So these are professionals working in charitable organizations, and explained to them the experiment. And then they told them what the control group's giving rate was, 28%. And then they asked the professionals to predict the giving rate among the first-time donors who received a thank you call. So this is the group that got the status quo intervention, a thank you. And on average, the professionals estimated the giving rate for the thank you group would be 53%, so almost double the rate of the no thank you group. And Samick and Longfield also asked regular citizens, about 5,000 of them, what they thought the rate of giving would be in the thank you group. And they also predicted roughly the exact same amount that the professionals did, a little over 54%. And so if we had a poll feature, I would ask you to type into your phone your guess for the donation rate in the experimental treatment group, the thank you group. But we don't have a poll, but just guess your own value. What do you think the actual value was for the giving rate, second donations for the thank you group? So remember, the popular wisdom says the saying thank you increases donation, but we have this randomized controlled trial where we have 10% of the first-time donors did not get a thank you. We don't expect any difference in their giving rates with or without thank yous because they're just chosen at random. So we can compare them just like a vaccine trial. And what we see is exactly the same giving rate in the thank you group. If anything, it's a little bit lower. There's no evidence that saying thank you increases donations, despite decades of doing this. Makes sense. Surveys tell us that it makes sense and that it works, but there's no evidence here. This is a large experiment, 600,000 people. You can see those margins of error in the red bar, they're very tiny. So it's very unlikely that there is a large effect here and that they're missing it. And this pattern that a randomized controlled trial, a partnership between academics and practitioners in the field overturning popular wisdom is very common in other fields. I'll just give a few examples. Some of them you may already know. One of the most famous is from medicine, where when people had head injuries and arrived at the hospital, they were given steroid injections because steroids decrease swelling Head injuries often have swelling inside the brain. We don't want that. So for decades, these injections were given because it seemed like it worked. It made scientific sense to give this. The mechanism was obvious to people. But finally, someone ran a randomized controlled trial where they randomly withheld the steroid injections from some patients and not others. And what they found was the injections not only didn't make outcomes better, they made them worse. They increased the death rate. And that practice was stopped. Another example comes from criminal justice, that in a lot of regulatory environments, crime or environmental regulations, we use fear of punishment to try to encourage behavior change. And the Scared Straight programs were programs in the US where they brought adolescents, young people who had committed some crime, they brought them to prison, adult prison, to see how bad it was in prison and talk to prisoners about how horrible prison was. And they found when they looked at the participants before and after they visited prison, crime rates went down. And these programs started to proliferate. Luckily, there were several researcher practitioner partnerships that ran it as a randomized controlled trial where some juveniles went to the prison and others did not. And then they compared their subsequent crime rates, and they found that crime rates went up, not down, the opposite of what people thought. That the reason they saw crime rates go down in the previous studies that were before after was simply because as people get older, on average, they tend to commit fewer crimes. It wasn't the program causing the reduction, it was the maturation or the aging of the youths that did that. And the last example I give is an example of a program that had a huge amount of data and narratives to support its claim of effectiveness. And it received a lot of money in the US to scale it up based on these data and these case studies. It's called the Camden Coalition Program, and it was targeted at people who use the healthcare system a lot more than other people. They're called super utilizers. This happens in healthcare, social welfare programs, and the idea was to try to intervene to try to get these people to reduce their use, right? To give them alternatives, to train them, give them human capacity, use data to help them identify where to go and when to go for healthcare use, connect them to insurance. And it got a lot of press, had a lot of data behind it. And while they were scaling it up, some programs agreed to collaborate with researchers to run it as a randomized controlled trial. And when they did, you can see underneath the picture there, they found no difference in utilization between program participants and non-participants. Right, so these are just some examples. This is very common to see. We don't have a lot of examples of these sorts of experiments in the agro-environmental context, but we have a few, and I'm just going to talk about some of them. Others, you can follow up with me later to get more examples. All right, so the first one I want to talk about is the popular wisdom that was held by the US Department of Agriculture that sending reminders to farmers immediately before the program sign-up dates were not helpful for decades-old programs, like this particular one called the US Conservation Reserve Program. It's a couple of $1 billion a year program for land retirement, temporary land retirement. And it's been going on since the 1980s. People know the schedule, they know the cycle, particularly those who have participated. And the US Department of Agriculture did not want to send another reminder near the date because they thought that was a waste of money. But they agreed to randomly send reminders to some farmers and not others. And what they found was, contrary to the popular wisdom, reminders increased participation. In that same experiment, same collaboration, they tested another source of popular wisdom, that farmers look to other farmers for cues about how to behave. Right? This is likely to be true, but the problem is it's not clear exactly how to leverage that insight. This experiment used social comparisons where farmers' behaviors were compared to other farmers in a way to try to get them motivated to participate more in the program. and there was no evidence that these social comparisons affected participation by farmers. A different experiment tested a very popular idea in both Europe and the United States that every farmer is different, so farmers want more program options, that we have to offer them a menu of different options that they can choose from that fits their particular needs. And the problem is that sometimes programs become so complicated that it's hard for farmers to actually identify what to do, or they procrastinate because they need to think about it some more. So inside of a conservation program, they randomized the number of options they gave to farmers. And what they found is that farmers who received more options were less engaged in terms of took fewer actions to try to learn more about doing conservation practices on their farm. All right, one more example. And this was a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, a nonprofit environmental organization, and researchers who were working with non-operating landowners. So I don't know if this is an issue in Europe, but in the United States, a lot of farmland is rented, and the owners are not farmers, meaning they're not operators. And so they rent it to operators. And there's a lot of evidence that environmental practices or environmental friendly practices are adopted at lower rates on these rented lands. And there's lots of reasons hypothesized why that is. One of the hypotheses, based on survey data and interview data, was that non-operating landowners don't know how to put conservation practice requirements into their leases with operators. Oops, somebody's moving my slides. I am not doing that, that's weird. I will go back. There we go. And they ran it as a randomized controlled trial, luckily, with some other treatments. If you want to read this article, you can see them. But they found that providing landowners with lease templates that explain exactly what you need to say to your farmer, and all they need to do is fill in a couple of spaces that were left blank that were specific to that farmer, they didn't affect the adoption rate of conservation practices, saying that the inability to put it in a lease was not the binding constraint in this context. And Julie mentioned this program that I co-direct called CBEAR, which does two things. It brings insights from the behavioral sciences to environmental programs. The idea is that we're trying to change human behavior. We really shouldn't only be relying on agronomic science, but we should also be relying on behavioral science, psychology, economics, sociology. And the other goal for CBEAR is the one at the bottom right. And what I'm talking about today is to try to create a culture of experimentation and agro-environmental program design. And I don't mean experimenting with crops or fertilizers. I mean experimenting with the program designs themselves, with these partnerships between academics and program managers to test these ideas that drive our program designs but are largely untested. All right, so I think people know the answer to this, but I want to just reinforce the reasons why we experiment. So the first one is that most innovations, most of what we do works no better than the status quo. How do I know that? Well, just from looking at other fields. 80 to 90% of what's been tested in large-scale social experiments, what private sector tests in their own experiments, doesn't move the needle, doesn't change things by very much over the status quo. That means that we're probably doing a lot of things that are not changing a situation on the ground, and that's a waste of time and resources. We want to learn faster that things are not working so that we can move on, right? So when we try a new idea, we try to learn as much as we can about it, and that seems obvious, but the problem is that many of our ideas, it's not clear exactly, even if they're true, how to implement them in a program. So I'll go back to that idea that farmers look to peers, to other farmers, to decide what behaviors are acceptable and desirable. That is undoubtedly true. Right? That is not, we don't necessarily need more evidence that that's true, but it doesn't mean it's easy to figure out how to operationalize that insight. How do we take that insight and then change our program to leverage or harness that insight? That's where things often don't work, right? And a lot of people think we're learning by doing, right? That we just go in and we can learn by surveys, by observing. And that's actually very challenging to do, right? And you've heard correlation is not causation. It's really hard to discern our impacts. And I want to emphasize that I do a lot of work that's not experimental. I think it's important. I think it can be useful, but I also think it's very challenging. I'm just going to give you an example from my own research, where I have a paper that says that using these non-experimental statistical methods actually can replicate what a randomized controlled trial does if you do it well. But then Casey Wichman came and said, well, let's try that again, but use a slightly different comparison group, a non-experimental control group, use the same methods, use the same evaluation criteria, whether these methods should work. The evaluation criteria said they should, and we could not replicate what had been done in an experiment. It's extremely challenging to look out in the world, naturally occurring programs and variation in how humans are behaving, and determine whether or not program features or changes in program features lead to changes in the field. And this is why experiments have power. I think everybody here knows, but I just want to reinforce this idea. I know that somebody was giving a presentation on farmer field days. That's a big thing in the United States as well. Again, this idea that farmers learn best from other farmers, they trust farmers. And there's lots of efforts to try to get farmers to go to these field days. And then there's the question of whether when they go to the field days, does it actually change behavior? And the nice thing about randomized controlled trials is they make learning easier. As we say in the US, it's not rocket science. Program people can do this with just a little bit of help from researchers. It's very easy to pick one group at random and give them something slightly different from another group and then compare their outcomes. In this slide, we're just comparing whether or not people attended Farmer Field Day. This is an outreach experiment. But we could also use the same interventions to look downstream to see whether going to a Farmer Field Day actually leads to changes on farm behavior. But the most important reason for why we should do experimentation is the same precept that medicine use, primum non nocere. First, do no harm. We spend a lot of money trying to improve the environment, improve the welfare of farmers, without a lot of evidence that it helps achieve those objectives. And what I mean by harm, I don't just mean we actually make the environment worse off or we make farmers worse off, which is possible, but that we spend years using programs that are not effective when we should abandon them and try something else. And that's the main reason why I think experimentation is important, is because we often have this precept of do something. We need to do something. People are using too much fertilizer, too much pesticides. They're emitting too much greenhouse gas emissions. We need to act, and then we don't learn as effectively. Right? If we had a precept that says first do no harm, if we slowed down a little bit, at least for some of the things that we do, we might learn more and make the programs more effective and have faster results in the end. And I often get this idea that we can't experiment, right? It's just too difficult. We don't have the time, we don't have the resources. But my argument backed is always that we do run experiments. We run thousands of experiments. We do different things in different places at different times. It's just that these experiments are not controlled experiments, and so that they're hard to learn from, right? We often have variation in what we're doing. That's all an experiment is creating variation in exposure. And we don't do that variation in a way that we can learn easily from it. And at the end, I'm going to talk about it. It doesn't have to be as simple as a treatment and control group. There's a lot of clever ways to manipulate the implementation of a program in ways that make learning easier. I'll be talking about those toward the end. All right, so just to reinforce, I'm talking about a culture of experimentation. That we don't have that yet in agro-environmental, or really in any environmental field, whether it's in agriculture or outside of it. We have one-off examples of experiments, but we don't have this culture where we ask, test, learn, and adapt, where program administrators and academics collaborate. And that's what I think we really need to have. They have this in other fields. We need to have in the agro-environmental field if we're going to make progress on the goals that we're trying to achieve. Right? So we want to start with the same way we start all programs, is we ask a question. Might we be able to change a program or develop a new program to achieve our goals? And we base those ideas on field experience, qualitative research, theories from behavioral and social sciences, empirical studies from other contexts that might be analogous. So we do that, but we don't do the next step, is the testing with experimental project designs that ought to be supplemented with qualitative research and field experience. About saying that we want to only rely on experimental project designs. It's just that right now we don't rely at all on them, and I think that's a mistake. Right? So we want to test these ideas, evaluate which ones work. And here I'm making it very simple. We're doing plan A versus plan B. It doesn't have to be that simple, but we evaluate, and then we decide which one is better. In this case, we say plan A is inferior to plan B, whether it's on cost or effectiveness criteria. And then we go back to the cycle and we ask another question and we test it and we evaluate it. And then we make a decision on what to do, and then we ask and test and so on. Right? Ask, test, learn, adapt. You often get the response that we do this, but the weak link is that testing link, that we can't learn effectively if we don't test. Right? And if we're not learning, we can't adapt effectively. In the private sector, they've already picked up on this. The last 20 years have seen an incredible growth in experimentation, particularly online, but even offline, by the private sector. And I just have some anecdotes here just to reinforce this idea. There's a quote from Jeff Bezos from Amazon that says the success at Amazon is a function of how many experiments we do per year, per month, per week, per day. Facebook, the same way. About 6 years ago, they estimated that a Facebook user, every time you log on, you're a participant in 10 randomized experiments on average. Capital One, the credit card company, runs over 80,000 marketing experiments each year on credit card offers, just on credit card offers. They run experiments on lots of other things as well. And they claim that these experiments have led to a lowering of the cost of acquiring customers by 80%. And in other fields, non-environmental fields, in the US, federal, state, and local government agencies run or fund experiments. I know this happens in other countries as well, but I'm most familiar with it in the US. Give you some examples of places that regularly do these experiments, constantly trying to learn in the poverty context, health context, education context, a variety of contexts, just not the environmental context. And during the discussion, we can talk about what I often hear is, well, environmental is different. That's why we can't do these experiments. And I'm not convinced that that's true, but I'm happy to discuss that later. The thing I want to point out is, particularly in the agricultural context, is that you often hear we do a lot of experimentation in agriculture. If you talk to an agronomist or an extension agent, they would say we do lots of experiments. Right? And I have a picture of what we typically mean, or what we understand when someone says experimentation in agriculture. We think of these on-farm trials, right? Either on an experiment station or on a farmer who has volunteered to do an experiment on their farm, right, where we vary crop varieties, we vary the fertilizers we use, we vary what we do around them to see if we can reduce runoff or soil erosion. But the key attribute of these experiments is that human behavior is typically held constant, or they try to hold it constant in the typical agricultural trial. And that's the major difference I'm talking about here. I'm talking about experiments in real programs where human behavior is not held constant, where farmers adopt a new pesticide and may change lots of things in their farming operations that may counteract the gains of the new pesticide or may actually complement, and you get more benefits. But we don't know, right? It's very difficult to predict human behavior based on theory and just non-experimental data. We need to have experiments that go all the way from the original technology and ideas, so on-farm experimentation. I'm not saying we don't need that. You want to test new technologies that reduce fertilizer needs or reduce water needs on farm to see if they actually work in the ideal conditions. But then we don't continue that experimentation when we try to get farmers to adopt it. Right? What works best to get them adopted? What works best to get them to keep using it over time so they don't disadopt it? What works best to actually achieve the environmental gains that we're hoping to achieve via that adoption and persistent use of the technology? So I was looking at the time. I think I have 25 minutes by my clock. I just want to give a couple of examples from other fields that are much more challenging or bigger interventions than the ones I gave you before in the agro-environmental context, just to reinforce this idea that we can do experiments on program activities. So this is from an experiment that was testing whether safety inspections in manufacturing plants actually reduce worker injuries. And it was actually interested in two questions. So one, the common wisdom, the popular wisdom says that these inspections reduce worker injuries. There's never been a clear test of that. And the other is that there's the debate over the impacts on the facilities themselves, on the businesses themselves. Business say that these safety inspections reduce their earnings, whereas safety advocates say they don't reduce the earnings. If anything, they raise the earnings because they raise worker productivity and they allow you to attract better workers to your business. They got academics to work with program managers to actually randomize the inspections. They were going to do inspections anyway. They were going to leave some facilities that were not inspected. That's just normal. They can't inspect every facility every year. But they designed it using randomization so that'd be easier to learn from this. And what they found is that the inspected employers did see a reduction in injury rates, right, and injury costs, healthcare costs that were from that. So that reinforced the popular wisdom. These inspections do improve safety. And then they looked at employment, sales, credit ratings, and firm survival, whether the firm stayed in business. And they showed no difference between the treatment and control group, suggesting that these safety inspections improve safety without putting an undue, or at least a detectable, undue burden on the facilities. And this is an analogous debate in agro-environmental context. There's often this debate about whether what we do when we try to make farmers do particular practices on their land or protect their workers in particular ways, that we're not sure if it works, right? If it's cost effective or effective at all. And there's complaints from farmers that it's an undue burden on them and it actually costs them and makes it less likely that they can stay in business. Right? But we don't have evidence either way on these debates. And so we just continue to debate them over and over, year after year, without any clear evidence one way or the other. Every group has their own data, their own narratives, their own surveys to reinforce their argument. Whereas in an experiment, it's a lot harder to reinterpret this result. It's still possible. One can say, oh, maybe the sample size was too small, and that's why you couldn't detect evidence, unemployment or sales or credit ratings. Or someone could say you didn't look at the right metrics. You should have looked at other business health metrics to figure out whether or not there was a negative effect. But it reduces the range of debate at the very least, and in some cases, it can help end debates or advance debates to other questions, away from the questions that we keep debating year after year. Just another example from compliance. So I just why am I pointing out compliance? Because one, compliance experiments are very abundant, but two, it reinforces that a lot of what we do in the agro-environmental context is voluntary, right? Which should be easier to do experimentation than in the regulatory environment. But there's lots of examples in Europe and the US where tax authorities treat citizens differently in how they interact with them in an enforcement context to try to figure out what's the best way to achieve their goals. And the other important attribute of these experiments, I'm going to come back to that later, is not only they tell you whether or not changing a program works or not, but it also helps address issues that are about the mechanisms, right? Do people not comply with laws because they're rational and they weigh costs and benefits, or because they're cognitively bounded? They don't understand the law. They don't understand how it applies to them, or they forget about the law because it's not salient in their decision making. We often have these two competing behavioral models, the rational farmer and the cognitively bounded farmer. And they exist side by side. We have programs that pay farmers to change their behavior, which assumes that farmers are rational, and the reason they don't do certain activities is because the costs outweigh the benefits. And we have programs that help farmers with technical assistance, because we believe that farmers just don't understand how they could change their practices and be better off and have better environmental outcomes. And it's not clear under what context these two models are accurate, right? Are they, what programs, what kinds of farmers? If I only have €1 to spend, how much of it should I put in financial assistance? How much should I put into technical assistance? We don't know. Instead, we have groups that fight over these allocations, but we don't have a lot of evidence to support one model or the other, or understand when is one model more accurate, one behavioral model more accurate than another behavior model, which then informs our program design. So a lot of these experiments are testing both a particular intervention and an underlying behavioral model or theory of how the world works. And that's when these experiments are most powerful, when you learn the most from them. You learn about how to improve a particular program, and you learn how to improve other programs for which the behavior issues are similar or analogous. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that we should be doing more of these experiments, and I want to give some advice for starting them based on my own experience trying to do these over the last 15, 20 years with program people. So the first, this is directed toward the program people, is to use their power, right? In most contexts, there is enough flexibility to do testing, that program managers have the ability to test. They can treat people differently. They already do. They do pilot programs only in certain areas with certain farmers. They phase in the programs over time so that one year they'll start with 100 farmers, next year there'll be 200, then 300, and so on. There's already a lot of this variation that we're doing, not on everything, but at least a lot of things that we could learn more from, but we're not exploiting that power. Right? We're just picking areas to work in because we've worked in them before, or because it's closer to the capital, or because we know somebody there and they've said they want to work on this, right? Opportunity or convenience, which makes it much harder to learn. Second is this issue of, wow, we can't have a control group who's not allowed to have access to the program and a treatment group that does, or one group that gets technical assistance, another gets financial assistance, another gets both. We can't do that, right? So that may be true for some programs, not all, but some. But in those programs, we often can do other things, like phase-in. I mentioned that before. Sometimes we cannot make a program go to scale across a country all at once or across a region. And in those cases, if we picked at random where we're going to start or with whom we're going to start the program, we can use the later participants as a control group for the earlier participants. And we can use that setup to learn more about the program. This won't work in cases where it takes a long time to see the impacts, but in other cases where we're just looking for short-term behavioral changes in on-farm practices, we can use that sort of design. In other programs, we have oversubscription, meaning that more farmers want to participate in a program than we have resources to give them. And in those cases, what typically gets done is we use a first come, first serve rule, or we uniformly distribute the resources across all groups, generally lowering the amount that every farmer might get. But an alternative that they do in other fields is that they use lotteries to decide. We have 500 farmers interested. We only have 250 farmer resources available, resources for only 250 farmers. Let's do it fair in terms of how we allocate it and use a lottery. And these have been done in lots of other contexts, in poverty programs, health programs, and these are very effective ways to both allocate the oversubscribed resource and, importantly, to learn, because those who get in, who get the resources, are no different on average from those who don't get the resources. Then you can look at the effect of those resources that you're giving farmers. And in other cases, we might not be able to vary what we do with farmers. And everybody has to have access to the same program, but we can vary the level of encouragement that we give to farmers to participate. We can do more marketing to some farmers and not to other farmers. Sometimes we already do that. We identify hard to reach farmers. We put more resources into them. Right? Those might be good social criteria for deciding how we vary encouragement across farmers. Certain areas are priority zones for environmental goals. But we don't learn as much from that, right? Whereas if we encourage at random some regions or some farmers and others we allowed to participate, but we didn't give them strong encouragement, whether it be through outreach or actual incentives maybe, or lowering the cost by helping fill out the paperwork, for example, for them, then we can get variation in who's participating that's unrelated to the attributes of the farmer, and we can learn more, just like from a very standard experiment. It's a little harder. You need a little more statistical machinery. It changes the interpretation a little bit, but it can be done. Right? And we're not taking advantage of this idea that often the resources we have for encouraging farmers to participate in a program or interact in a particular program or adopt a particular technology or practice are scarce, and we can't allocate it to everyone. At least not at the levels we would like to. I think I'd encourage, this is for the academics, but also for practitioners, is to start small, and mechanisms are a good place to start. Do we understand the context correctly? So often we've taken questions that aren't very important for the program, but by doing the test, we'll get some better insights into this behavioral model that we were talking about. So for example, CBEAR, the organization I co-direct, has run experiments within auctions that farmers are bidding in auctions. And we've randomized information that the farmers get, or we randomize the starting bid values. Right? And when I mean by information that they get, we're trying to give them stewardship messages to reinforce the stewardship identity, to make them bid less for technologies that improve the environment. Right? These features that we're randomizing aren't super important to the program managers, but they do give us insights into whether or not farmers are purely rational in the economic sense, where they would ignore stewardship messages and they would ignore the starting bid value, that anchor, that would have no effect on their final bid. So by doing these experiments with program people, we can start to just get at this basic idea of, are farmers purely rational, in which case we have levers for working with them, or is there scope for some other sorts of program design features that may lead to gains because farmers are actually cognitively bounded in a lot of their activities. And this doesn't threaten anybody's program by doing that sort of experimentation. But typically, the best interventions are those that are proposed by administrators. This is something they really want to work on. Tweaked by academics, so the academics help maybe tweak the intervention so that we can learn more, that it's more strongly based in theory, and then either can implement it. CBER has programs that are implemented by the US Department of Agriculture or a nonprofit organization, and some interventions that are implemented by CBER itself, because the government said, we don't think we can do that intervention, but we're really interested in learning what comes from it. So it's still a partnership, but who implements can vary. All right, important lesson, protect jobs and egos. A bad proposal is to say, I want to compare your program against your program doesn't exist, right? No one wants to learn about that. It's like someone asking you in the audience, I want to do a test of the influence of your research on anything, right? So I want to compare the world where you exist doing research and the world where you don't exist. Very few people want to see the results of that experiment, even if it could be done, right? A better test is a horse race like intervention A versus B, where we learn something, but no one's identity or ego or budget is at risk as a result of that experiment. Right, so what you want is to be able to say, these are equally good, or one's better than the other, but it's not, your program is no better than nothing. That's a bad experiment to set up because people don't want to do it and cause problems afterward. Right. Well, how do you measure the outcomes? This is a big challenge in the agro-environmental context, right? How do we measure whether we're having an impact, right? What we always recommend is to start with administrative data that's already being collected. That's less expensive. All right, then move to surveys, and then ultimately to field observations if you can. Those are much more expensive to do. Politically, it's difficult to look at what's happening on farms, but there's a lot of creative ways to measure the outcomes. But this is a big challenge in doing these experiments. Number 7 is sample size. This is a big challenge in doing experiments. I do not recommend people do small sample experiments. Right? Why? Because first, you're unlikely to find anything, and that's going to disappoint both the researchers and the practitioners, and then make it harder to do future collaborations. Second, if you actually do find something, meaning statistically significant, it's likely to be grossly exaggerated, right? Because most of these interventions have modest or small effects. The only way you're going to get a statistically significant result in a small sample is if it's something really large, like the effect. And generally that's going to be exaggerated. And then what we've often found is practitioners don't like to replicate. When they find something seems like it works, they want to scale it up immediately. And if you do a small sample experiment that has a large exaggerated effect, they will scale it up based on that evidence. And that's generally not something we'd want to support if we can avoid it. Sometimes you can't avoid it, but if you can, try to get larger sample sizes. And then last, but this is the most important piece of advice. This is the major constraint that I find working in the agricultural context, is failure is not rewarded, whether it be government agencies, whether it be the private sector businesses, whether it be local governments, NGOs. people are rewarded for success, right? Experiments, which are about learning, right? Whether you get success or not, are generally not rewarded. People say they reward learning, right? We want to learn. Everybody wants to learn. Everybody wants evidence. But it's a classic public good problem where no one wants to contribute to it because there's a big risk. If you show that you just spent hundreds of thousands of euros on some initiative that has no effect, you generally don't get rewarded with more money. And that's a problem. Right? From the very top, we need policymakers to incentivize learning rather than success, at least in some contexts, so that we can do this sort of experimentation. All right, so I'm wrapping up. So in the question and answers, we can argue exactly how much of our scarce resources should be allocated to these sorts of academic practitioner partnerships for controlled experimentation within agricultural programs. I'm not going to argue that most programs should be done this way, right? But what I am going to claim is that our current allocation of 0%, approximately 0%, can't be optimal, either from a social or a scientific perspective, right? Experimentation has been shown to be incredibly powerful in all these other social policy fields. We can argue about, methodological pluralism, that every method has its advantages and disadvantages. I totally agree with that. I am not what they often call a randomista who thinks that everything should be randomized or else we cannot learn. Most of my work is not experimental. But that said, we're doing none, right? We're doing no experimentation in agricultural programs. And again, I mean this kind of experimentation that's in the programs themselves. And that can't be good. We're not developing the evidence that we need to make these programs better. We're not resolving these debates about what are the constraints or what are the incentives that are leading to the kinds of patterns we see out there in the environment and the economy. Right? So at the very least, I hope we can all agree that we should do more of this, but we need these partnerships and we need creative thinking for how to most effectively do this in the political, economic, and logistical context with all of its challenges that we're working in this field. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that people might have or challenges to what I've said.
Thank you very much, Paul. First one, from Yann Reynaud, you show that many conventional agricultural programs are ultimately ineffective compared to status quo. A current trend is to co-design programs with relevant stakeholders. Are you aware of any results that show whether this new mode of design is more likely to produce effective programs?
I am not aware, but that's a great example of a very good idea, co-design of programs that may be wrong, right? I mean, people have talked about this in other contexts like fishery management, that we should have fishermen and the scientists co-designing management programs. Fishermen say that's absolutely essential to making the programs appropriate for real fishing contexts. Scientists say that just waters down or mitigates the effectiveness of the management interventions. And we have co-design for protected areas, for biodiversity protection. In the US, we have co-design of environmental permits on the regulatory side for pollution, but we don't have any tests where we have some contexts where we co-design and other contexts where we don't. And they're comparable, and then we can test those ideas. If anybody knows of one, please email me. I'd be happy to learn about such an experiment. But as far as I know, there aren't any experiments doing that, but we could do that. We already do co-design with some people or some areas and not do in other areas. They're just not comparable. And therefore, we can't tell whether or not any differences in patterns that we're seeing or lack of differences is a result of the program or the co-design or something else. So that's a great example of something that can and ought to be tested.
Alexandre Souchere from INRAE. Thank you, Paul, for this very interesting talk. You promoted really a randomized control trial, and at some point you compared them to quasi-experimental approaches. And you said it can work, but sometimes it doesn't. We have to be very careful. And last week, the Nobel Prize was awarded, in particular for natural experiments. Are you aware of any work that compare the results of RCTs and natural experiments, or what is your intuition on the power of these kind of experiments?
Yeah, so there is a small literature that's called either design replication or within studies, comparisons, that takes randomized controlled trials that have been run, throws away the randomized control group, and then tries to find a naturally occurring comparison group and use quasi-experimental methods and design to try to estimate the program impact or the treatment impact, and then they compare it to the experimental benchmark. That literature is hard to interpret, right? Because some say you can, some say you can't. And the problem is, and I've experienced this because I've published these, is usually the quasi-experimental people know the answer. They know what the experiment found. And therefore, they can make decisions that they justify, and they say, oh, this is the way we should do it. These are the controls, or this is the instrument that's the best based on theory, but also happens to give the answer maybe that we want in the end. So there's very few that have actually done a true horse race where one team runs an experiment, a different team does a quasi-experiment, and then they compare the two results. So I do believe that quasi-experimentation is absolutely necessary. Of course, the Nobel Prize winners have advanced our thinking on this. And I don't think they won the Nobel Prize because these methods have been shown to be effective in lots of contexts. I think they won the Nobel Prize because they really clarified the conditions under which these methods can be effective, and allows us to actually judge better in a particular context whether we think we can use quasi-experimental methods to recover a estimate of a program impact or a variation in some causal variable in the field. So I don't want to dismiss quasi-experimental methods. I use them, but I also know they're extremely challenging to judge in terms of whether you're getting the right answer. There's lots of things that people can do, sensitivity analyses, bounding treatment effects to be more credible, but those methodologies are not necessarily going to get you published because they make your results look weaker. And they're very difficult to communicate to program people. An experiment is super easy to communicate to program managers. They understand vaccine trials, drug trials. They understand why we do them. They understand how to evaluate them. They do not understand advanced statistics and identification strategies and matching and instrumental variables and all the other things that we do. In fact, it looks like we're doing things to get a particular answer, right, to the outsider. So it looks opaque and hard to understand. So another strength of experiments is the ease of communication. Thank you for that question. And if I didn't answer it correctly with that long answer, let me know.
Okay. So I have another question, and then Sophie. At start, Paul, you presented the circular figure that describes what should be done repeatedly to provide evidence that can inform policymakers, but I did not see any stage for the theoretical mechanisms that may explain the likely results. Is there room for theory, and if yes, at what stage of the experimental process?
When you said, is there room for, did you say ERE?
Theory mechanisms,
oh,
theoretical mechanisms.
Yeah. So the theory should definitely be done in the beginning. And then I didn't talk about it in depth because it's more challenging and technical, but in that evaluation part, before you decide whether something works or not, is to try to evaluate the mechanisms either through the design right? So you can actually change the design to try to elucidate mechanisms. And I mentioned that. I think those are really valuable and important. Or you can try to use qualitative data, survey data, maybe some other statistics to try to elucidate mechanisms. But it is challenging just to estimate average effects of an intervention. It's even more challenging to estimate mechanism effects. So I do think they're important, but I think we are so less advanced in other fields that I think mechanisms is something we don't necessarily need to focus on right at the beginning. I think it's extremely valuable, but I worry that an emphasis on mechanisms can make it so that we don't get any work done because people say, first I've got to randomize, then I've got to do this evaluation, then you want me to do all this extra measurement to get at mechanisms. So, I think it's important, but I also think there are things we can do even without mechanisms, like they do in health, where they don't know the mechanisms, but they know it works. That's still an advance, although there's still more advances that would be useful.
Another question? Yep.
Thank you, Paul. It's Sophie Toyer from Montpellier. I really liked your talk, and I just take this this as a way also to say that we have an equivalent network in Europe, which is called RECAP, and which advocates the use of experimental approach for the evaluation of the common agricultural policy. I had one question, though. You focused all your talk on RCTs, and okay, this can enable us to measure the causal impact, but not necessarily the underlying causes of impact, which is a bit different. And I was wondering, what is your opinion on maybe mobilizing the whole range of experimental approaches, not just RCTs, but also lab and field experiments, at least to understand why we get this impact, and I think we can combine them with RCTs even for ex post, or not for ex post evaluation, but for the evaluation of policies in a kind of, or this morning, this is what I presented, like you have a wind tunnel testing, then you test a prototype, then you do test flights, for example. That would be the RCT part.
Yeah, I totally agree. First, thank you for mentioning RECAP. I wanted to mention RECAP. It's a great network, and we're involved just to do what we can to promote it. And I'm sorry I did not mention it. So people should Google RECAP if you haven't heard of it. They're trying to do this sort of work, both what Sophie's talking about in terms of lab work, as well as the social experiments that I'm talking about. And I totally agree that the lab in the field experiments can help in this, both ex ante, to decide which of the many ideas we have should be the ones to be tested in the field, because we often can't test lots of treatments in the field because of the sample size problem I brought up. It can also be used ex post, when we see a result that we don't really understand and we have some ideas about why that might be happening. We can go to the lab and test those ideas to get at mechanisms like Julie talked about. The other thing I would mention is that experiments can also be used to convince policymakers to run a field experiment. So we're doing that now, where when US government tries to get farmers to do more environmental practices, they're voluntary programs. They often go into an office and they pick what practices they want to do, and they get to see how competitive it makes their offer compared to other farmers. But they start with nothing and they build up the practices, they add practices. Behavioral science lab experiments have argued that if you start with the most environmentally friendly bundle of practices and you make farmers take away practices, that they'll end up with a higher level of environmental practices, right? So this is a default or an anchoring effect. We wanted the US government to test this in the field, and they said, we want to first see that this actually works in an experiment with farmers in an interface that looks like this program. So it's a lab in the field experiment that we're running now. And if we do see the effect that we think we might see, that will be convincing to the policymakers to try it in the field. That they don't want to just go from theory to field experiment. They want this intermediate step that, Sophie, I think you're talking about, using lab experiments. So I definitely think they're complementary. I didn't mention it, one, because it wasn't the topic of my talk. I saw that you were also presenting on that. Also, just because if I had a choice, if I could only do one, I would rather do the field experiment than the lab experiment. But in many cases, we can do both, or we can only do the lab experiment, and we should. Thank you for that question.
Hello, thanks a lot for your talk. My name is Niklas Möhring. I'm working at the CNS here in France. And my question was, what is your reason, I wanted to hear your viewpoint, why we are so much behind with RCTs in this domain? Because you were touching on that, but not really explaining. And my personal, I would say, suggestion would be maybe because when we look at the agriculture system, we are actually at a system, a socio-economic system, which is totally embedded in a natural system, right? So you have a lot of uncertainties, for example, in the future. You have feedbacks in the system and so on. So basically the targets are moving all the time, which would maybe make it harder to evaluate something with an experiment. But that's just my personal thought on this, but I would like to hear your opinion. Yeah,
that's a great question. And I don't mention it because I could only speculate based on my experience. And I think you're right that there are issues that these coupled human natural systems are perhaps more complex than systems in other contexts. That makes certainly measurement more complicated. We have bigger spatial scales, bigger temporal scales. But a lot of what we do is very analogous to other systems. And we can at least look at the intermediate outcomes, right? So maybe not the ultimate outcomes of long-term persistence of pesticides in the environment, but we can at least look at the behavior change. Right? That is something I think is doable, but I don't think we do it because in the environmental field, social scientists have not been the major drivers. Right? It's been natural and physical scientists, maybe engineers, lawyers, at least in the United States. And when they do experimentation, it's in a very specific context. It's like those field trials, right, on agricultural stations or in voluntary farms that are part of these trials. They don't think about human behavior as science or a object of scientific inquiry, and they don't think about doing experimentation. Where in the poverty field and the health field, they've had a longer history of doing experiments, and that's filtered in to the policy world because it's driven by behavioral social scientists or medical or health scientists that have long been doing this. Whereas in the environmental field, it's still natural and physical scientists and engineers that are driving the programs and policy designs. And there's both a lack of awareness that these experiments could be done, that these are scientific questions about what programs might work and why they might work. And there's also this idea, I think, that humans are not that complicated. We're all humans. We can just observe how they're doing. Whereas if you're talking about a crop variety, that's more complicated, and that needs to be tested more rigorously. So I think there's both the context is more challenging in some ways, and also the composition of leadership and their disciplinary backgrounds is different in our field versus some other fields, and that can explain. I mean, one of the last fields to do experimentation in the US is education. And again, that had this history of having people who are leading not be social scientists or not being social scientists that use experiments. And that's changed over time. So now you're seeing many more experiments in that context than you did in the past. So I think we might be one of the last policy fields to do it because of our history of the disciplines that lead our field. But that's just a hypothesis.
So, any additional question from the audience? So maybe we can stop here. Paul, before you leave, can you tell us about what is on the wall just behind you?
So this is an abacus. You know an abacus? I think the word is the same in other languages, but maybe it's something else. We're doing mathematical calculations, but it's made with, these are shoulder pads from women's suits from the 1980s and 1990s when shoulder pads were a much more popular thing. And this is old pantyhose. So it's recycled textiles to create an abacus with the different billions, millions, hundreds at the top. Someone was going to throw it out, and I said, don't throw it out. I put it in my office because I can't do arithmetic, and this will be useful.
Presentation, thanks. I know you're very busy, so it was a great honor to have you for this conference.
It was a pleasure, and I wish you all luck trying to bring social science. As I said before, I think it's critical that this is fundamentally social problems, human behavior problems, and we need more social science in this field. So good luck to everybody. Wish I could be there. Bye-bye.
So now we're going to listen to Alain Carpentier, why we should seriously consider taxing pesticides. That's another story.
This is a presentation which was prepared with Hervé Guillaumard, who is also an economist. So I will talk to you much about cost and revenue, prices, and incentive in general. So I will track money indeed. And okay, on the other side. Yeah, so the starting point of this research, indeed, that's in between a research work and an expertise work, because I don't do much estimation or whatever. That's what we have done, is that we have analyzed what happens and try to find solutions to improve the situation. Indeed, there are many policies have been launched for trying to reduce pesticides in the EU. It started in the mid years 20. And in 2022 arrived the European Green Deal, which include a 50% cut in pesticide use in EU agriculture, which is very, very ambitious. But when we look at what about the results of the past policies regarding pesticide use, the success have been very, very limited. Okay, and so there are many reasons which could explain that. For example, the past dependency mechanism is often advanced for at least for explaining this situation, because, for example, the alternative to pesticides are not very competitive because they have not been worked a lot in the past, and there are also various lock-ins along the agri-food chains. That's also true. That's true. But the problem is that when you look at the economic and regulatory landscape, it didn't change a lot for a long time, at least for decades. And the problem is that the current agri-food system and the current practices are very well suited to the current regulatory and economic context. And everything is coherent. Technologies are coherent, practices are coherent, and the organization, the industrial organization of the agri-food system is also coherent with those technologies. And the problem is that if we want to change something about pesticide use, we need to change the landscape. Okay, the socio-economic landscape, which is on the top of the figure of Gills and Schott, is very important, and that's where especially EU policymakers can do something. They can change something, and especially through the common agricultural policy. Okay, so that was why I decided to work with Hervé on this issue, because he is a specialist of the common agricultural policy. He has made a lot of work on this, and say that maybe this work on pesticide policy is the kind of follow-up of what he has done on the common agricultural policy in general. So what we have tried to do is say, okay, if we would be the EU policy makers and we would like to cut pesticide use in EU agriculture by 50%, what would we do? And without any constraint on instrument choices, But because we try to be policymakers, say, okay, we have to deal with acceptability issues. We also have to take care about taxpayers' money. So we should design a policy which is as efficient as possible. Of course, you'll see that our propositions are quite disruptive because we'll use taxes and very high rate taxes. But the point is that what is important is that what we would propose has been already used in the past in the common agricultural policy. That is, strong price incentive have been used in the common agricultural policies. Strong and large compensations have been given to farmers, and that's what we will do. Okay, but our main assumption, we have only basically one assumption, is that actors respond to economic incentives. Okay, and that's very important. But that's natural for an economist, of course. But that should be also natural for everyone. For example, because we will mostly deal with firms and farms, and firms and farms are purposely created for making money. So they count money, they count cost, they count revenue. So they respond to economic incentive. Okay, and often the current situation about pesticide use is explained by economic mechanisms. And okay, we take that for granted and we say, okay, let's turn and let's orient the economic mechanisms for changing things. And just to illustrate the point and to illustrate what is at stake here, here are the estimations we have computed regarding the efficiency of fungicide protection for wheat in France, based on data from Arvalis, which is a national institute on wheat, on cereals in general, or arable crop in general. In the green line is a net return of the first spray of fungicide on wheat in France from 2008 till 2020. And on average, it's about 140 euros per hectare. That means that if farmers are not allowed to spray at least once fungicide on wheat, they will lose about 140 euros per hectare net. Okay, and that's very important. The second spray is the blue line. It's about the first spray it saves about 1 ton per hectare on average. Okay, 1 ton per hectare. That means that if you don't allow farmers using fungicide, you will have a large impact on markets. The second spray is the blue line is a return to the second spray. Okay, it's often positive. It's small. The return is small. It's positive. And what happens is that French farmers use about 2 sprays to protect the wheat against disease, and that means that, given these figures, they are rational from an economic viewpoint. They are rational from an economic viewpoint. The third spray, which is a red line, is generally negative, and farmers, on average, don't do it. Okay, that means that they are rational, and what's at stake is relatively important from farmers. Okay, so now, how could we change the common agricultural policy? Let's return to the definition, or to the construction of the common agricultural policy. It's a wide scope agro-environmental policy. It has to deal with many issues. It has to achieve many objectives, and it combines many instruments which are single measures, which are combined within a wide policy. And here we will focus on EU-wide instruments, the one which need to be implemented for all member states. When considering pesticide use and pesticide use reduction in particular, it's useful to distinguish 2 types of instruments. Okay, the first type of instrument, this is not a standard typology, but it's useful for our purpose. There are incentive instruments. Incentive instruments are instruments aimed to change behavior and to orient behavior, to initiate changes. Okay, there are command and control instruments, which are norms, bans, and so on, which are imposed to actors. There are also price incentives that are also imposed to actors, and And we believe that firms and farms respond to those incentives. And there are also subsidy schemes, which are different because they are only proposed to actors. Okay, they are proposed. We provide them with money for doing something. Okay, and these instruments, in principle, should be implemented for changing, for forcing people, for forcing actors to change. And there are another type of instruments which are used for facilitating changes. Okay, they are proposed to actors, say, okay, if you want to change, I will support you in your transition. Okay, and these instruments include also subsidy schemes, and they also include all support to research, development, extension, information and knowledge dissemination, and so on. Education, which is very, very important. Okay, what is important is that both types of instruments are complementary. Okay, if incentives are the fuel to the change, facilitating instruments are the lubricant to the change. Okay, and they are useful. Both are useful, and in particular, facilitating instruments, they enhance the effectiveness of incentive instruments. Okay, for example, if you want farmers to turn to agroecological practices, you can set price incentive, but you can also disseminate the principle of agroecology, references about agroecology, and so on. What is also important is that facilitating instruments are basically useless if there are no incentives. You can propose facilitating instruments to people. If they don't want to change, they won't change. Okay? Facilitating instruments are only useful when people want to change. They are willing to change. Otherwise, you propose something which is of least interest for them. So now, when we look at the composition of the cap in terms of instruments, which has been done by Hervé and his colleagues, is that the cap includes many facilitating instruments, and especially numerous subsidy schemes, various subsidy schemes. That's huge. But the problem is that when you look at the instruments, there is almost no incentive instrument. There is almost nothing for pushing people or for pulling people to change their behavior or their practices. Okay? And that's especially true with respect to agrochemicals and eco-friendly practices in general. So what could we do for changing the cap and providing more incentive to reduce pesticide use? In this case, basically there are three types of instruments. First one is incentive taxes on pesticides. There is one case study in Denmark, which is notable because it's very instructive. But otherwise, taxes which are implemented on pesticides are very small taxes, which are not incentive. Okay, there are taxes that are just implemented for raising money. Okay, and the purpose is very different. So they are not taxes, they are not incentive taxes in this case. Otherwise, there are command and control instruments. To sum up, when we deal with pesticide use and how to regulate pesticide use, we need to distinguish two types of instruments. At least it's useful to distinguish two types of instruments. There are instruments which are intended to force changes or to incentive changes or to push people to change their practices. And there are also the second type of instruments are the instruments which are used for facilitating changes. And the second instruments are proposed to people for easing their changing or for easing their transition. Okay, both types of instruments are complementary, but when we look at the composition of the cap with respect to those instruments, the cap almost don't include any incentive instruments. So if we want the cap to be more effective regarding pesticide use reduction, we need to implement incentive instruments, either incentive taxes or command and control instruments, which are also necessary. For example, standards on pesticide toxicity or ecotoxicity are absolutely necessary. There are also non-treated areas depending on member states. There are standards on sprayers and so on. They are also necessary. And there are also, we can also use subsidy schemes, okay? But not too much. Because as we will see, subsidy schemes are not very well suited to the point in this case. But it's important to note that subsidy schemes are widely used. They are widely used in the CAP, especially because they seem to enable to kill several birds with one stone. They can be used as incentive instruments, facilitating instruments, and maybe more importantly, they don't hurt farmers. They don't hurt farmers' income because they are only proposed. They don't entail any income loss. So there is no, that's why they are favored by policymakers usually, okay? So now let's compare the three types of incentive instruments we could use. And what is important to recognize here is that norms and subsidy schemes are poorly suited as large-scale instruments for reducing pesticide use. And why so is that first, both instrument types are prescriptive. That means if you want to implement subsidy schemes or norms, you need to codify what farmers do, because you need to codify the prescriptions. And we turn to the point which was raised by the jurists and by Christian about the fact that alternatives to pesticides, pesticide-saving practices are numerous and they are complex. They need to be farm-specific. They need to be adaptive. And they are not easy to codify. For example, I've been involved in a discussion with agronomists about the definition of the crop rotation measure. What is a good crop rotation? That's very difficult to define, but if we want to implement norms on acreages or on crop rotations, we need to define what is a good rotation and what is a bad rotation. And that's very difficult from an agronomic viewpoint. So the second point is that implementing effective command and control instruments is very difficult because it's difficult to implement norms which are constraining from a political viewpoint. We can see that when dealing with greening measures, the conditionality measures in the new CAP, that's awful because that's always bargaining about this issue. And usually, and I guess that you have heard our French Minister of Agriculture say, we have to set conditionality measures or conditionality conditions which allow all farmers to get direct payments. That means that there is no constraints, okay? And also, for example, bans can be very costly to farmers. Remember the case of fungicides. If you ban fungicides and, for example, SDHI are part of the fungicides which are used by French farmers producing wheat, that could be very costly for them. And so when they are implemented, bans, they are implemented with numerous, more or less temporary or local exemptions. That means that they are not implemented almost at all. And also the incentive effect of subsidy schemes is fairly limited for two reasons. First one is that you can only subsidize technologies or alternatives you know. The new ones, you can't subsidize them because you can't prescribe what farmers to do. And also, there is no incentive to further decrease pesticide use once you have reached for what you are paying. Okay, that's why the incentive effects of subsidy schemes are fairly limited in this case. Norms and subsidies are useful, but not as large-scale instruments to be used EU-wide. Of course, that's why we talk about that. Input taxes, and especially incentive input taxes, they succeed where other instruments fail. And that's why they are interesting as instruments to be implemented on a large scale for reducing pesticide use. For example, their implementation cost is fairly low because you don't have to control what happens in each farm. You only have to control what happens at the frontiers, and there are fiscal and custom institutions which are best well suited for that. And they are also adaptable. For example, the tax rate can be adapted to the properties of pesticides. It can easily be adapted over time. And taxes have strong incentive properties because they put pressure on any unit of pesticide which is used. They put economic pressure on that. And especially that it important in the long run, because if you plan taxes to be implemented for a long time, that can induce technological and organizational innovations. And that's why you need high tax rate, rate taxes, because you want to induce innovation, because you want to secure profit for potential innovators in the future, for them to invest today. Okay, and that this point is also very important. And also, what is interesting with taxes is that their incentive effects are wide scope, because they are not prescriptive. And pesticide taxes, they foster the demand for any alternative to pesticide, for any pesticide saving practices. Okay, whatever you do, if you decrease pesticides, you will decrease your tax, the amount of the tax you pay. And that's very important. And that's very important because what's at stake is very important. So you need agroecological solutions, equipment, and solutions. Precision agriculture can be also be on board in this solution. Plant breeding is also part of the solution. And that also means that because incentive taxes are wide scope, they are also complementary to any other instrument you want to implement. Okay, if you implement taxes, you will increase the efficiency of any other instrument. Okay, and that's very important. And in passing, there is also an observation which is important, is that right now farmers receive very inconsistent signals regarding pesticide use. They are asked to reduce pesticides. Okay, pesticides are bad for the environment, they are bad for public health. Problem is that when you look at what happens for farmers with respect to pesticides are available on markets. They are relatively efficient from a technical viewpoint, and they are relatively inexpensive. I tell you, don't leave the chocolate on the table if I'm alone in the room. That's for sure. Of course, and that's why incentive taxes are not implemented. They imply significant economic losses for the tax sector, that's for sure. And that's why they are not very popular for farmers, that's for sure. And here we face a major issue. Small rate taxes are useless. They don't hurt farmers' income, but they are not useful for reducing pesticide use. And of course, considering high tax rates is unacceptable, but it's also necessary for making change, for obtaining changes. And the problem is here, we would like to tax pesticide usages without taxing pesticide users. And the only solution to turn around this issue is to compensate farmers for the loss they incur when the tax is implemented. Okay? So, and that's not unfair, because we ask farmers to reduce their pesticide use for the benefit of all of us. And they shouldn't be the only one to pay for this. And that's important for us to share the burden of the pesticide reduction with them. I guess that's my viewpoint on that. And also what is important is that when economists propose to implement incentive taxes, that's mostly to orient, to direct farmers' choices towards less pesticide use. That's not to punish them. And that's very important. That's not to punish them. We just want to signal to farmers that we would like them to reduce their pesticide use because we don't like pesticides in the environment and in our food. And second, incentive taxes are not implemented for raising money. And especially if the tax is very incentive, it kills its basis. Okay, if the tax rate is sufficiently high, farmers won't use pesticides anymore, and you won't get any money. You won't collect any money with the tax. Okay, so the point with the incentive tax is to change choices. Okay, and now returning the tax revenue to the tax sector is increasingly proposed for acceptability purposes. And in France, there is a turning point. There has been a turning point in 2018 with the Yellow Vest movement, which was initiated by the threat of a tax on fuel, on gasoline, and that demonstrate to, especially to economists, that okay, a tax is a good instrument from an environmental viewpoint, but we need to take care about redistribution issues and income issues. And economists are starting, before they focused on mostly efficiency issue of the policy, and now they are caring about income issue, redistribution issue, and I think that's a good idea. So our proposition is a proposition a la Tinbergen. That means that we have two instruments, we have two objectives. We would like to reduce pesticide use, but we would like to preserve farmers' income. That means two objectives, or one objective and one constraint. And Tinbergen say, if you have N policy objective, you need to use at least N policy instruments. So we have two objectives, we will use two instruments. The first one is imposing high rate taxes for reducing pesticide use. That's the incentive taxation scheme. And then we would like to return most of the tax revenue to farmers, one way or another, okay, for preserving farmers' income. But the caution point here is when you return the money to a farmer, you need to preserve the incentive effect of the tax. That means that you need to take care. You can do it, you have to take care when returning the money. And our proposition is to use area-based compensations defined per crop type and per region, okay? Because we have to take to account for crop heterogeneity with respect to protection needs, and we also need to account for heterogeneity across regions. And the idea is to return the amount of tax paid by the average farmer in each region for each crop type. That means that in a given region, for an hectare of a given crop type, all farmers would receive the same amount of money. And that's what preserves the incentive effect of the tax. That's strange. It seems to, you need a lot of data to do this, and a lot of institutions and so on. But for the CAP, that's not a problem, because the CAP already did it. When in 92, the price support to cereals and the indirect price support to oilseed was removed, that's very similar to a tax on the price of this crop, because that's a sharp drop in the price of this crop. And of course, without any compensation, European farmers would have lost a lot of money. But the income effect due to the removal of the price support was compensated through area-based compensatory payments defined per crop type on a regional basis. And that has been done in 92. That's quite the same that what we propose now, okay, in this case. So that means that's possible, one way or another, okay? And there are also case studies of tax on nitrogen oxide emissions in Sweden, which about the same. So that's possible. We can do it. That has been done, one way or another. And there are also other advantages of combining incentive taxation and income compensation schemes that, of course, high tax rates are more acceptable to farmers and also to maybe to policymakers. And what is important is that compensation support farmers' income. That means that allow farmers to keep on using their current practices while seeking or while testing new practices for saving or for reducing their pesticide use. And that also means if you return the tax revenue to farmers the way we propose, that also induce small rewards to small input uses and small penalties to large input uses or to large input users. That's not unfair either, okay? That also reminds that incentive taxes are aimed neither to collect money nor to punish farmers. And this kind of scheme can be tuned to manage specific issues. For example, we have to take care when defining crop types because they can induce very large crop acreage changes, and that's what we are planning to do within the FAST project in this case. So just to conclude on this point, as economists, we would propose to combine taxation and income compensation schemes for pesticides as a backbone of a policy aimed to reduce pesticide use, okay? That policymakers won't adopt it, but that's our proposition, okay? Of course, that's not the only instrument. Those instruments are not the only one to be used. There are many other instruments which are necessary in this case, okay? Many of them are part of the CAP. Others could be conceived that will be done in, for example, that some of them probably will be proposed by the FAST project. In particular, what is important is that the instruments we are working on mostly target farmers and farmers' choices. The problem is that if we want to really reduce pesticide use, we will also need to change upstream and downstream industries practices somewhere or another, and that's very difficult to do because we don't have much work on that. But Mourad will propose will show what he has done on this issue, but that may be a very challenging point regarding pesticide use reduction because the whole value chains are adapted to the use of pesticides and they are organized while taking benefit of the properties of pesticides with respect to specialization and so on. And also, reducing pesticide use raise major international trade issues, but that's not specific to the tax. That's specific to any policy which is successful in reducing pesticide use, and we will also address these issues because they are very important. For example, you probably have heard about the studies on the effect of the Green Deal on the world market for grains and so on. They are all about those issues. So, thank you.
Online questions?
Yes, we have several questions in the chat.
So there are several questions about how to fix the amount of the tax for a given active substance. How, for instance, do you consider that it's needed to differentiate?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So you say that. So the question is how we decide the tax for new substance for which we do not know what we, because upstream company will put new product on the market. Yep. So let's see if there is other questions that are the same before you answer. And then, so Robert Finger answered that we could take the toxicity, but then the question is, okay, but we don't know the toxicity of new molecule. Then there is another question related to this one, which is what about natural pesticide? So are we going to tax only chemicals or also natural products that we don't know exactly what the toxicity is? So let's see. And another question is why don't you choose to tax upstream company in order to put the incentive on the upstream company instead of the farmers?
Okay, so we'll just
can you do something with that?
Yeah. I agree. We need to adapt the tax rate to the toxicity and the ecotoxicity properties of the pesticide, whether they are new or not, whether they are synthetic or natural. That's my view on this point. And the second point is about why, who needs to pay the tax. The problem is that the tax, whether you collect it from firms who sell pesticides or from farmers who buy pesticides, that's the same. That's the same. The problem is that the collection point is important, is for reducing as much as possible the collection burden, the collection cost. Otherwise, the effect of the tax will be the same. For example, if you put a tax on pesticides, maybe the pesticide dealers will share part of the tax, but it will depend on the ratio of elasticities and so on. But that will happen the same, whatever the collection point.
Thank you. So Ines Bouchma, I presented earlier this morning. I actually have one element of answer to one of the questions on the chat.
Thanks.
And I also have a question for you, Alain. So I'm asking myself, how concretely will you tax? So will you tax when it's used or when the farmer buys the pesticides? Because you can buy pesticides and in the end not use it during the year or use it in 3 years. So it's not the same. And to address the answer, to answer the question on the chat, in the European Union, you have like toxicity level, and there are risk indicators. So we know even of all the pesticides that's on the market, you can know that this one is really, really risky, this one is not risky, and so you can adjust the tax to this level of harmonized risk factors and criteria.
And actually, there are already, for example, in France and in many European countries, are already taxed. Pesticides are already taxed, and in France, they are taxed according to their toxicity and ecotoxicity properties. But the problem is that the tax rate is so small that it's almost innocuous for farmers. Otherwise, the fact that the tax is paid in France, it's paid by firms because that's easier to make firms. The point is that if farmers purchase pesticides for using them, so you don't care. You don't care when you collect the tax. What is important is to reduce as much as possible the collection cost.
Sophie.
Thanks, Alain, for your presentation. As you know, we've also worked a lot on the issue, and
oh yeah, sure.
I would maybe first like to clarify that I think the European indicator that's currently used is not a real risk indicator, so I wouldn't use that for risk assessment. And I think the Danish example that you put forward is a good example where it's of course not the example that we should apply everywhere, but I would say that the issue there is that we define risk reduction targets, but most countries don't have a risk indicator. So each country should probably start by defining such an indicator. Then they could use that for tax.
Yeah, but that should be defined for the whole EU. That will, for example, avoid competition distortions, which are often advocate for minimizing the effect of pesticide policies in Europe.
Yeah.
So, for example, for me, the Green Deal was a very good news. Because say, okay, for once we will be able to set up to set a policy EU-wide, and we won't have to discuss about or to negotiate about competition distortion across member states within the EU. And so the pesticide policy should be defined at the European scale.
Yeah, I agree, but I think we need real risk indicators then if we want to reduce risk, and otherwise we end up somewhere where we don't know. Yeah. We showed that in a publication that if you use the wrong indicator, you put the incentive on the wrong indicator, then you might end somewhere you don't want to go. But actually my question was a different so sorry. So my question was, you suggest basically to combine this with area-based payment, but wouldn't it also be imaginable to have like a kind of push-pull strategy where you combine this with kind of subsidies, for example? I know it's then hard probably to hit the point where you distribute then again to the right farmer, but for example, more efficient technologies like sprayers, where farmers could, in the long run, also save money again, but giving them investment compensation or something like that. What is your point on this?
Yeah, the point that subsidy, what is important is that subsidies are prescriptive. So you need to define what to subsidize. Okay, and the point is that, for example, maybe subsidizing the purchase of precision sprayer may be a good idea, but you need farmers to be willing to purchase those sprayers. And if you want them to be interested in buying very high precision sprayer, you need pesticides to be very expensive because they want to purchase high precision sprayers because they want to save pesticide use. And the higher the price of the pesticides, the more it is interesting for farmers to invest in pesticide saving alternatives or practices.
There is a question in the chat about from Eduardo Trumper, who is in INTA, Argentina. That means that you have people from very, very far from that are listening to you. Would it be possible to modulate taxes not only according to toxicity, but also depending on availability of alternative pesticide management practice?
No.
So I know that you are going to say no. So explain to Eduardo why.
And that's the whole interest, that the very precise interest of compensation. You can tax at high rate pesticides even if they don't have any alternative, because that won't hurt too much farmers' income. But that will put pressure on farmers, and they will see on the bill, say, okay, this pesticide is very expensive. That's not a problem right now because I receive the compensation. But the point is that what is interesting with this is that farmers looking at their bills, they will say, okay, they will go to INRAE and say to researchers at INRAE, hey, have you seen my bill of pesticides? Don't you have any pesticide saving practices for this kind of pesticides? That's awful. If you succeed in providing me with such kind of practice, I will earn a lot of money and you will become famous. I don't know.
No, Sophie. Sorry.
Thank you very much. That was a very stimulating presentation, especially because you make old ideas look exciting. And coming back to old ideas, I'm a bit puzzled by your proposal to make the compensation based, not area-based, that's okay, but per crop. I would like to understand why, because you remember, because you gave the example of the 1992 CAP reform, this is what we did. We gave compensation payments per type of crops, and this sent a wrong signal in terms of, it sort of, hides the market signal. So why should you do this? Why do you need to have this per crop? Because this is going to send farmers looking for the highest compensation rate at some point.
Okay,
No? Okay, well, then tell me why. Because that's why we moved to proper decoupled payments. And the other question I have, it's maybe easier, is do you intend then to have this tax being increasing over time? Because I guess that would be also something interesting. And not only increasing, but farmers and everybody, in fact, should know in advance for the next 15 years what is going to be the rate of increase.
Yeah, I agree. For the second point, I fully agree, because indeed we want people, farmers and innovators and researchers, to invest in new practices, and we want to direct their efforts, their investment efforts, whether in time and in money. We want to orient them toward less pesticides. So we need to make them, we would like forward-looking farmers and investors to know that they will make profit if they invest in pesticide-reducing technologies, practices, and whatever. Okay, and that's why that's important to announce what will be the future. With respect to the compensation per crop type, indeed the compensation will depend on the crop, because crops the pesticide expenditures depend a lot across crops. And so if you produce sugar beet, you will spend, if you're an arable crop producer, you will spend more on pesticides than if you produce wheat. And the problem is that if you give the same compensation for the whole arable crops, people won't grow any more sugar beets or potato.
It's not wheat versus rapeseed.
Yeah.
So it's big types of crops.
Yeah, you need to, we have to manage crop acreage choices in this case. And that's why the compensation after the McShire reform were defined on crop types. Otherwise, people would only have grown maybe cereals or. But this is a point which needs to be discussed and more studied. That's for sure.
Last question. So I think Christian raises a hand. So it is the last one then, because then we need a coffee break.
Thank you, Alain. I've been asked to ask a short question, so I will make it very long. I have the feeling that what you propose to be somewhere between incentive instrument and facilitating instrument. When we created the certificate for economy of plant pesticide, in fact, we have a kind of hybrid structure.
That was the same idea, yeah.
Just incenting and facilitating. So we have all the attributes, and despite of that, it's very, very difficult to explain how to make this active, beyond the fact that it is a highly political issue. So I think that we really need to have a thorough discussion with economists like you and policy makers to be sure that it falls in the right place. But when we do that, we have difficulties with three issues, and I think it has to be taken on board. The first point is very close to what Sophie just said. In fact, we have difficulties to approach the systems. So we can easily target a crop, or a crop and a pest, but difficultly to approach a systemic change. And so this was the first thing. Second part, there are pesticides that are used in the downstream sector. Everything related with insecticide during grain storage have to be tackled because they are probably the worst pesticide we have on our shelf. And they are partly in the bread you eat every morning. So how to target that, because it does not fit in your story. And the last point is when there is no alternative. For instance, we will face a major difficulty to move out of the pesticides that are used for seed treatments. It's something like 27 million doses per year in France, so you multiply it by 5 and you have the figure in Europe. How to address that? Because today, there is no alternative. So, but we definitely need your help for the CEPP.
For the first point, the CEPP, the problem is that the idea is basically the same, because you want to increase the price of pesticides, but not too much, and compensate to some extent farmers. With respect to that. The problem of CPP is that it's linked to the alternatives, which are numerous and which are very heterogeneous. And that means that when you want to implement the system, which is clever, the problem is that it ends up with an usine à gaz. And that's the whole point. I don't know how to say it. That's a very complicated system to implement, indeed. And for the second point, of the insecticides which are used for storage, there should be instruments which are specific to this issue, because the one I presented, as I said in conclusion, it's targeted toward farmers. The point is, if you increase sufficiently the price of pesticides, you will also foster the interest of farmers into changing their system. That's for sure. But the problem is that you have to facilitate and that's a point which is very important, because it's not clear now, is that you need to demonstrate and to document the fact that diversified systems are less demanding in pesticide use. And that's a point which is very important, because right now that's not the case, at least as far as I'm aware.
Okay, we will discuss that during.
Not enough, at least.
I think.
For me, at least with references which can be used directly by farmers. That's the point, because if you are an extension agent and you say, okay, if you are an extension agent, you need numbers to show to farmers. They say, okay, look at with this diversified system, you will save this amount of pesticides. Wow, I'm not sure.
But okay.
No, but I've tried a lot. Maybe I'm too harsh about these issues. I'm probably too harsh. And the last point was about, I don't remember.
The last point was about where you have no solution.
Yes. No problem.
As long as you have compensation, the problem is not as important as when there is no compensation. The point is to put pressure for fostering the effort of innovators to find solutions.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and also thank you very much for your invitation to visit Paris. Yeah, I'm an assistant professor in the Business Economics group of Wageningen University, and I would like to present today some work that I joined to, because it's actually work of Lineke Bakker, a PhD student at our university, working at that time in the Farming Systems Ecology group. Now she graduated, got her PhD, and she's now working in another systems group at Wageningen. But I was asked to join her work because she wanted to also do some research involving social sciences. And we decided to finally use the theory of plant behavior, and we really went into an analysis of farmers' intentions. So what is driving actually their pesticide behavior? So let me switch to the next slide. First give a brief background, a brief introduction to our study. So I think what has been said a lot already is that in modern agriculture, farmers often make use of like external, often fuel-based inputs. So they rely on it, and that's how they, at least in the Netherlands, can obtain high yields. Well, they also have to, because they receive only low prices, and that is their business model. However, there are actually alternative pest management practices available that farmers could potentially use. So think of IPM, which was also already mentioned, or maybe other kind of ecologically based practices, but they are scarcely adopted. Well, farming systems research is actually indicating that this decision as to what to use is not only driven by farmers and their behavior themselves, but it's actually kind of interplay between farm characteristics, environmental characteristics, and the environment is understood in a very broad way, because it is also about the market, it's about the networks farmers participate in. But of course, yes, it's also about, well, the knowledge farmers have and their perceptions and preferences. So today I'm going to talk about, well, we applied the theory of plant behavior here, which is a theory from social psychology. I'm not a social psychologist myself, but this theory is actually, well, easy to learn, and this is also what we observe. So many people, also in agriculture, have started to adopt this model. So our focus is on individual behavior, while at the same time, as I will be explaining later when I talk about beliefs and how you elicit them, we try to take this picture into account. So when we start to look into beliefs, we take this system as a basis. So how does what is a TPB, the theory of plant behavior? What does it comprise to in terms of a theory? Well, first of all, it's very much dedicated to analyzing people's motivations. So instead of like looking into attitudes and social norms, which are very well-known variables in sociology and psychology, the inventors of the theory of planned behavior decided to really use these concepts, but then in a very specific way. I mean, not looking to them in a more general way, but really define a behavior of interest and then measure the attitude, measure people's subjective norms towards this behavior. So this is an important distinction. They started using attitudes, subjective norms, which were already known by then, but they started to apply them on a specific behavior. Well, those two constructs, they are the major constructs in psychology representing people's motivations. Finally, a stage later, there was another construct added to this model, which was termed perceived behavioral control, because people realized, well, sometimes it is actually not up to the decision maker, him herself, to really decide or to really engage in the behavior. Sometimes there are just factors that hinder the adoption or hinder the use of an innovation. So that's why it's also about the ability to perform. Well, I think, spend hours on this theory because I also like it. I need to maybe say a few things more before I go to the next slide. And that is, those constructs are also belief-based. So they are expected to be a function of certain beliefs, behavioral beliefs, normative beliefs, and control beliefs, which, well, and then what I should also say is that nowadays, within those constructs, people start to also recognize certain dimensions. So, for example, within subjective norms, based on the work of Chialdini, people start to not only measure subjective norms more in general, but they try to disentangle injunctive norms from descriptive norms. So this theory continues to evolve, which is also shown here. So nowadays there are also like a couple of individual differences and social factors suggested, which could maybe explain people's differences in the scores on these constructs. And more recently, the theory of planned behavior was also tried to be merged with goal systems theory, also a well-known theory from psychology. I didn't yet apply it, but it's actually on my list to once apply it, hopefully on farmer behavior. Well, but I also would like to stress here that the TPB is not only actually a theory, but it's at the same time a set of measurement guidelines. Because what the inventors of this theory have been advocating is that, well, beliefs are very important in this theory. So qualitative research is the very first step to take to go to the study population and really try to identify and elicit what is going on in the minds of these people. What kind of beliefs do they have? And so it's not in this sense that the TPB is a very, well, a kind of rational decision model, but it's expected that people are somehow, well, in a reasoned way, making their decisions. Then there is this principle of compatibility indicating, well, I said already before that in the TPB, it's important that you apply attitudes, subjective norms, to a very specific behavior. And that has also consequences for measuring your variables. And that's what this principle of compatibility is about. You need to be very specific in the way you measure your behavior. When I will explain my application later on, I will also show you how we did this. Well, when you have the possibility and you are able to collect enough respondents, ideally you try to measure an attitude or a subjective norm by latent variables, because such constructs are conceptually understandable, but very difficult to measure. In fact, you need multiple indicators to try to then represent them well in your models. And as Helena also touched upon it a little bit, there are different ways to do it, and sometimes those ways are even possible to combine, and then you end up, for example, in such a model in which you have both formative and reflective measurements. Well, then finally, also nice to stress, the TPB is quite clear on what likely are the main predictors of behavior, like attitude, subjective norms, and perceived behavior control. But in fact, this theory is also very open to adding more constructs. So I think one construct already mentioned today is, for example, the construct of self-identity. Well, it's perfectly fine to add self-identity to a TPB model, but then the authors have also some suggestions as to how to then test the effect of self-identity. Ideally, you try to then first see if self-identity is moderated through those three constructs and not like added as an additional main effect. Well, let me go to our study. So we applied this theory on farmers' pesticide use. First, we went to a couple of farmers to elicit their beliefs and identify them. Then we defined the behavior of interest, and we, as you can see, we really were very keen on how to actually define it. So we defined it as decreasing my use of environmentally harmful pesticides within 2 years is, and then they had to fill in a lot of statements. Well, of course, you need to make some decisions here. And the way you frame it here likely is also going to activate like a certain attitude, or they start thinking, okay, are people expecting me to do this? Or so the way you formulate your behavior is going to really affect the scores that you finally get. Well, we applied here a cross-sectional survey design. Of course, it has its advantages, but also its disadvantages. We had 15 statements for measuring some direct measures of the constructs of this model. And we had quite a few statements actually for all those belief-based statements, because as you can see here on the right-hand side, those belief-based statements are measured actually twice. You have a belief, a subjective probability, and you have a certain valuation statement. So each belief is measured twice. We complemented those questions also with some social demographics and farm characteristics. We sent, I think, the questionnaire to about 7,500 farmers. At least that's what the marketeer promised to us. We got finally 681 useful responses. And that's actually a thing that I'm really struggling with nowadays as a researcher. It's very hard to have sufficient responses. And I'm not the only researcher who is actually surveying farmers. And I have the feeling that sometimes those farmers get tired of all these questionnaires that they need to fill in. Well, how about the survey results? First, some descriptive statistics. So I'm now not already like doing regression-based stuff and trying to see how attitude is impacting on intention. I'm now just looking at the like-it skills, so skills that go from 1 to 5, and I try to see like what is actually in their minds of those farmers. Well, first of all, in terms of attitudes, they do not really perceive the behavior, like reducing pesticide use, as something good or bad. However, we had a few statements that were more reflecting the kind of riskiness, because attitudes can also be about risk. And they indicated really that reducing pesticides is a risky behavior. They were neutral on subjective norms, and they had a slightly negative perception about their ability to conduct this behavior, to perform this behavior. And they showed a slight intention to perform the behavior. But now, of course, we are also interested in, okay, do those factors based on the theory actually also explain this variable? That's what we are also interested in. But what we first did was linking beliefs to the attitudes, as the theory is suggesting. So we took those beliefs that we measured, and finally we estimated so-called mimic models, and this is then a result where you can see that, well, those indicators like yield loss, cost and labor, crop quality, well, that is going to, of course, have an effect when you start to reduce pesticides. They all loaded basically on this construct of risk. So in general, they think there will be yield losses, cost and labor will go up, crop quality will go down. And regarding, well, a more general attitude, they linked it more to, well, it is good for the nature and environment. So they see the benefits, but at the same time, they are very much, I think, concerned in their system how that will affect like yields and so on. Well, how about control? So what is their ability? Do they think they can really do this? Well, we could only explain 16% of this construct, so indicating that we were not actually able to very much identify the beliefs that are in the minds of the people. And the one that was actually the most significant was that they think they should actually switch to alternative like ways to well, maintain crop quality, make sure that the health is okay. And I will come back to that in a minute. So also regarding the social pressures, here it is interesting that for the injunctive norms, actually reference people from the society are more important than people from within the sector. So family, friends, supermarkets have more kind of social pressure, according to farmers, are more pressing to like reducing pesticide use than certain normative reference from within the sector. And well, we had mostly conventional farmers in the sample, and those conventional farmers actually think that organic farmers think they should reduce their pesticides behavior. How about these descriptive norms? Well, here you can see that farmers are actually looking a lot to what other farmers are doing, and I think that has been already stressed also here quite a few times. I'm not sure what the time is. I think I don't need...
I think that you still have, let's say, 5 minutes.
Less than 5 minutes?
But we start a little bit late. I don't remember how, 5 minutes late. So maybe you could have 7 minutes.
Okay, well then I have quite some time left. Thank you. So here in the slides before, I showed like how those beliefs were connected to some measures of, well, the attitude, the subjective norm, and perceived behavior control. Here I took just the direct measures, so I forgot about the beliefs, and I was interested in the question like, okay, what is actually driving the intention? Well, in my own research, when I was a PhD student, I applied the same theory to vaccination behavior, and there it became really clear that the intention to vaccinate is really driven by motivations and attitude, and a little bit by, well, social pressures, and perceived behavior control didn't play a role at all. Here you see, and that's nice, you apply the same theory. It's an empirical question. Here the intention to reduce pesticide behavior is actually not really driven by so much by motivations, I would say, but it's rather the ability together with descriptive norms that is driving here the intention. But at the same time, we actually see that it's a multitude of factors that play a role here. Well, I didn't go really into the heterogeneity yet of the sample, but I expect that likely some farmers are driven more by this factor and other farmers are likely driven more by other factors. So that's also important to take into account here, and it's also a critique on my own work. I estimate I did do as if my sample was a homogeneous sample, and of course, we are people, we are humans. I have to also look into the heterogeneity of the sample. Finally, I see always part of my job as also exploring new methods. So I read after Corona, I had to do a lot of teaching and I was totally fed up with all the digital. So I locked up myself and I learned myself a new method. And I learned myself to apply this method called psychological network analysis. And I just put in the beliefs, and then I related them to an intention, and I was curious, like, okay, is this method going to give me like new results? So it's not part of the paper, and it's preliminary, but I just wanted to share them with you here. So I have the feeling, and here's something going wrong, because this circle should have been like, I don't know what happened. But to me, like, this part is actually representing the beliefs that farmers have regarding the current system they are in. So it is about beliefs that they think, okay, if I reduce pesticides use, my cost and labor will go up, crop quality will go down, loss of yields will exist, I have less protection products choice. So this is the system they are currently in, and it's having a negative effect on intention. Then, to me, this represents, and I actually circled, though, this was the circle, they really perceive pressure from the society to reduce pesticides. And that's, well, it was, finally it all was mediated through this behavioral belief. And yeah, this could be a way to maybe give farmers a little stimulant, like, okay, there is pressure, please try to reduce your pesticide use. Then there was a third, this is, I think, a kind of third cluster, which might be also seen as a kind of pathway that we can utilize to make farmers use less pesticides. And I think it's one that is also applied a lot in the Netherlands, and that is through peer group pressure, to putting farmers into groups, let them learn, let them discuss how to apply new practices, how to apply new systems. So I think that is reflecting this. And then finally, a fourth kind of cluster is that farmers think, okay, maybe we should focus here, we should try to try new systems, because those control beliefs were about using precision technology instead of pesticides, were about using new rotations, or maybe different ways of rotations and varieties, and were about, using better cultivation advice. So to me, this is representing, like, okay, farmers are considering, maybe I should somehow leave this system, but I don't know how. because they indicated a kind of inability to move to this new system. Okay, I think I have already been indicating most of what I wrote down here, so I'm not going to repeat. I'm just now interested in some questions from the field.
So for the moment, there is no question on the chat. So if there is any question in the room, yes, you, so you. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jaap.
Yeah.
I really liked the presentation. I'm not sure I understood all of it. Some of it was quite advanced for me. So what I'd like to pick up on is this point you made somewhat early on when you talked about farmers being fatigued by the amount of surveys they're having to undergo. And so I'm interested in this because where I work, which is London School of Hygiene, I do a lot of work on water sanitation and hygiene. And there's actually a specific name for this, participant fatigue. I don't know how it's going to translate in French. It's called the bugger off effect. I don't know if you... So that's a rude word in English, but essentially it means that, you know, the more times that you come and knock on a participant's door, the more likelihood after multiple iterations of that they're likely to just say, yes, everything's fine, you know, now leave me alone to get on with my life type thing. So what, and my question is, you brought it up, so was this an issue that you suspected would affect some of the responses that you're getting about farmers' intentions, for example? And if so, how might you or how did you address it in the research design?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And
Just in case you want to react.
And it's a good one, and I don't have an immediate answer to it. I think many people are actually observing this, and also if you just talk to those people, right, farmers, you get this feeling that they are, and I think it also is because they don't know what you actually are going to do with with the survey results. To like what kind of goal is it fulfilling in the end? So I think you need to be transparent and well, and how did we try to check for it? I need to look it up. I don't know. I know there are some ways to do it. For example, you can check, for example, if a respondent is always filling in like the same answer and it's just a straight line, you probably know, you probably can then already estimate, okay, this is someone who's maybe already having critique on the topic of the study. So, but it's a good question. And well, we have been talking a lot already today about, well, using all kinds of ways to collect data in a survey way. But at the same time, I have sometimes a little bit the feeling, okay, this is also a bit maybe kind of risky approach, because in the end, we need to work with those people. And the number of farmers are actually also declining a lot. So are we using the right methods? Okay, but that's a different discussion, I think.
Alain? Alain?
Thanks for the talk, that was interesting. I would like to raise a point about heterogeneity, which was also raised by Elena this morning. And the point is, yeah, sometimes some of the links you uncover with the mimic method, they may come from specific groups of farmers of subsamples within the point. I don't know if the method you use allows you to maybe realize the typology of farmers or whatever. I think that's important because, for example, when I discuss with my colleague agronomist, and I would like to apologize about the effect, the problem of references, because they are used to work with farmers which are not typical economic to be, because they are much involved in, they have pro-environmental attitude, they are relatively skilled and experienced, and maybe some of the relationship you uncover with this kind of method is very specific to farmers group, and that's very important because when it comes to policy instruments, what may work with some farmers may not work with others.
Yeah.
For example, when I talk to farmers and when I was asking for references with numbers and pesticide costs and so on, that because I think of, for example, farmers I know who own a large farm and who tell to me, say, I will turn to agroecology if it pays. Otherwise, I won't turn to. So that's why the question of references with respect to this kind of practices is important to me. I would like to know, so my question,
yeah.
sorry, my question is the mimic method able to allows you to uncover this kind of farmers group or farmers subsample?
Thank you for your question. As far as I know, I think this mimic model is using everything at the mean level. So it's assuming homogeneity. But of course, you can do some deterministic clustering of people and then estimate those models also at different group level. But I am also thinking, for example, to apply, for example, latent class analysis or cluster analysis, and then see if those patterns that we found are robust across those groups. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, and now the next challenge is to find some time to really do this.
Any other question? Christian?
Thanks, Jaap, for the presentation. So my question goes in the same direction. I'm not an expert in theory of plant behavior, so I take the opportunity to ask an expert a bit and increase my knowledge. So I was wondering always when I read the kind of articles with the theory of plant behavior, how actually sensitive is this approach to phrasing the different kind of attitudes, beliefs, and so on, and how replicable is this when you do this another time with a different group and so on, because in a sense there are so many relations that you estimate at the same time. So as my gut feeling as an econometrician would be, it's quite sensitive maybe, but I'm also not an expert in theory, so I would just, what's your opinion on this and your take on this?
Well, yeah, so I had an opportunity to also work with the inventor of the theory. So it's this paper, and it's actually published in an agricultural economics journal, so that's also fun. And I think what he really is advocating is that it's not only like that attitude is explaining intention, but he also really proposed some guidelines as to how to measure those things. So it's not that you just arbitrarily define some statements and then do like correlations or regressions or whatever else, but it comes with certain measurement guidelines for doing it. So in that way, it is somehow standardized, and that's all based on like findings from psychology and psychometrics and etc. But I agree with you. Like those people are sometimes a little bit from a different planet than econometricians. I think econometricians are interested in different things. They sometimes think different about causality. Like really having a dialogue as to how things can, well, how we can exchange knowledge is I think also important, because maybe you could also apply this TPB in a kind of randomized control way. Maybe because if you only take the direct measures of this theory, you have only 15 statements. Well, I think it's just about an A4 or less. And with those statements, you can already see like what's going on here. What type of behavior is it? Is it more driven by motivations or more driven by the ability? So I think we can learn a lot if we are also open to each other's methods, strengths, and weaknesses.
Two last questions. So there is one online and maybe one from Christian. So the one online is it about the control. The question is, could you elaborate on the measure of the control of pesticide use, and more precisely, did you find important differences among farmers regarding this parameter? And have you explored if those differences are related to other farmers' characteristics?
Yeah. I think for the last two questions, we already discussed them a little bit. Like, okay, here I assumed homogeneity in behavior, but of course it's driven by heterogeneity. And regarding, well, the control, well, I think this different findings are indicating that indeed farmers are maybe not very motivated themselves. They perceive social pressures to reduce pesticides because both type of norms were explaining intention after controlling for all other effects. And at the same time, a very important construct that turned out also to be explaining intention was this control factor, indicating that it's not just simply motivation. It's also that farmers don't really know how to act. And you could even go further and distinguish a capacity from an autonomy dimension within this construct. But yeah, I think we should keep it for now like at this.
And Christian, what was your question? Last one?
So it's exactly on what you just said. How do you take into account the education? Because maybe there is an heterogeneity. It's probably less heterogeneous in Netherlands than in France, but I think that's for young farmers, their education is really playing a major role in especially perceived control and how to act.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, indeed, and I think in the survey, the survey includes like a question about what is your education level. So we could indeed maybe group farmers into high education and low education, and then see whether those results are robust or whether they start to differ across those groups. But that's work we didn't include in this paper, but sure, that's subject to, well, could be very nice for follow-up research.
Thank you.
Okay, well, hello. This presentation was made by Anne, Véronique, Claude, and myself. Anne from Zurich and me will do the talk. So if you look at time right now, you may consider that we are more in after-time work than in a decent, proper time to conference talk. So we'll start our presentation softly with a snack. Please click and there is a little delay, but it will work. We don't see the presentation change, the slide change. Okay, so this is the snack. So I don't know if you know, but most of the people try to open the banana by the top. But if you do so, you hurt the banana, you waste a little bit of the product, and you get your hand dirty. But if you focus on the bottom of the banana, please click on, you will see that with a little pressure, you will open it softly and properly. So this is just a picture. Please click on to underline something that contrasts our presentation regarding to the other presentation of the day. We will talk about bottom-up approach. This is the aim of our presentation. The second picture that we will present, please click on, is that even for top-down solutions or bottom-up solution, today in sustainability issues, we have a lot of controversies, and you have changed the display. No? Okay, well, it's fine. There is a lot of controversies and distance among the stakeholders of the issue that make difficult even top-down or bottom-up solutions. So I think that after the COVID pandemics, we are all aware about this, and the presentation that have been done today underline also these controversies and difference among and distance among the stakeholders around the environmental issues. Please click on. Now let's talk about these controversies. In Europe and in the East, we have the allegory of the cave. we consider that a man understands his impact, the impact of his living and his impact on the world through his shadow. But in the East, yes, they have another metaphor paradigm, which is the blind monks and the elephant. I will not explain it now because it will take time, but you can look at internet to understand this. This second paradigm underlines something that is interesting to work on the controversies and to cut the distance between stakeholders. It underlines that we need to work on sharing visions and understanding to change the world. If we remain at an individualist approach, we will be fatalist. We cannot change. But if we share our vision and our understanding, we may find smart solutions and change our point of view. And this is the aim of our presentation, and the pesticides is a relevant questions to work with through those kind of approach. Why? Because there is multiple actors in the last presentation of Jaap underline it. There is multiple actors with different behaviors, sometimes the conflicting interest, something that can be considered as a curse for someone can be a blessing for others, and every action of one actor can engender uncertainties and feedback loop or impact on other actors. So since we are in a wicked problem like this, like pesticide, how can we work to make people working together to foster the public policy making and to support the public policies? Click on, please. So to tackle these problems, we will present the serious game approach, which is the aim of the presentation that we will do today. And the plan of the presentation will be according this. There's 3 points. So Anne will display to you and explain what is serious game, then how serious game is used and can contribute to public policy making or to support public policy. Then we will back to Paris, and I will explain, I will display a quick overview and some research that is ongoing research in the FAST project. So now I will put you in handback. I will fly to Zurich where Anne.
Thanks, Mourad. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me? Exactly. So who plays game on a regular basis in the room? And by playing game, I mean at least with another person, not on your mobile phone, and with some kind of game board. If you can raise your hand or if you can vote for those people who are online. And I can't see on my little screen, but we're what, about 10, 20%? Yeah, about that. Well, I asked the same question to our students last week, master students, and here we have 70% of them still playing. So when and why do we stop? Where is the average age where we drop from 70 to 20? I don't have the answer, and that's not the topic of this presentation, but let's keep this image in mind. I'll come back to it later. Because as a matter of fact, why I started with this question is because play is an important element of culture. We are a playful species. And if you observe kids, they only learn through games and role plays with different level of complexity. And we can even extend to the mammals at large. They also do play as a simulation and rehearsal and training exercise. And here you have a cat play fat, and it's a training for the day they will meet the dog of the neighbor, maybe. So games are definitely associated to childhood, to fun, to entertainment. So where is this idea of serious games coming from? Well, actually, it traces back in the 70s when Clark Apt had the idea to put together two terms that are apparently opposing or contradictory, seriousness and play. And he was the first one to coin serious games as games used for purposes beyond entertainment. That is to instruct, to inform, to train, to teach, and also for planning and problem solving in government and industry. And we have to remember, nowadays, there's a bit of a misunderstanding or confusion when we talk about serious games. People always associate it with digitalized and computerized game. We have to remember that back then, the computer were absolutely not the way they are right now. And APT was referring to card games and board games. And the other also that was really implementing in pushing the serious game into the world of business and management was Richard Dukes. He paved the way for the use of such games in businesses. Here I do a little aparté for you to remember that actually such games were used way before they were called serious game in the military and defense field. The most famous one is this Kriegspiel on the left side that was developed by the Prussian army to teach battlefield tactics to officers. And this game was actually adopted as a serious tool for trainings. Later on, the US Army picked on such methodology, and Rand Corporation developed lots of serious game, and not just game theory, I'm talking here. And nowadays, I've just discovered recently, they also have a center for gaming as part of RAND. So the use of serious game beyond just pure entertainment is well developed, well institutional tools in specific domains, such as military, health as well, and business. But pesticides is not yet a domain for the defense, and it's more linked to environmental issues. So what about serious game and the so-called socio-ecological system? Well, in this field, in this domain, we can probably say as French people, we are proud that the French were quite pioneered here. And back in the early 90s, there was a consortium of researchers starting from CIRAD, but later on being joined by research from INRAE and IRD. And they developed the so-called companion modeling approach. Basically, there were a bunch of researchers interested in what's happening really at the intersection between social dynamics and, here, if you see my pointer, between social dynamics and ecological dynamics, what's happening there. And they came up with an approach, a posture, and a set of tools with two main objectives. Companion modeling being a participatory modeling approach to, one, improve knowledge and better understanding of the complex socio-ecological system. And the second one is to support collective decision-making. So in practice, what it works and what it's all about, it's definitely an iterative process. You have lots and lots of back and forth between the lab and the field, core problem definition, redefinition of the problem as the process evolves. And basically, the whole idea behind is that we all have our own mental models of the world. They are segmented, they are partial, sometimes they are flawed, but still we take decisions on a daily basis based on our understanding of the world. And basically, behind the idea is they wanted to create some kind of stakeholder arena by involving people in co-designing, co-sharing their understanding of the world, coming up with a model as a shared and a simplified representation of the world, and in doing so, hoping to modify individual model and the way we make decisions. So the idea is really to enlarge, enlighten, or modify those mental models. Okay, COMOD there's a lot of tool in the toolbox, but people tend to reduce it to the most striking or emblematic part, which are the role-playing games and the agent-based models. Here you see a few examples starting from Madagascar on the left, to Colombia in the middle, to Zimbabwe, where they are using an agent-based model projected on the table. Okay. So nowadays, there's actually a large community of researchers using such games in the field of environmental science. And the games they are developing are multiple diverse. So in trying to extract the core common elements, what I call the DNA, what we are using at role-playing games. When people join a session, we tell them to embody a role, their own role or the role of their opponent, but they play a role. The game is, as I said, co-constructed model. We don't do model for the sake of modeling. We co-construct the model to support dialogue. We have players in the room, multiple players, and a facilitator. That's key. And also, it's always a combination of briefing, game, and debriefing. We give the starting rules and the constraints, but what we want is that our games are open for new rules, new roles, or new scenarios, the counterfactual that Julie talked about this morning, for example. We take a step aside from realistic representation. I'll come back to the idea in a second on realism. And also, there's no winning strategies in our game. We don't script strategies. We don't tell the players, as a farmer, you need to maximize profit in your game. because in doing so, we lock the system in one direction, and that's the contrary of what we want to do. Maybe to reposition our games with other approach that have been mentioned earlier on and that will be mentioned tomorrow. I don't know if you know this paper on games as tools to address conservation conflicts. Basically, they did a review of game used in theoretical approaches like game theory, experimental approaches like choice experiment, and what they call constructivist approaches like the companion modeling games. We're definitely here to highlight management solution and engage scenario. And maybe one thing, the idea is not to rank these three approaches. They all have their strengths and limitation. There's no magical one for a recipe, else we wouldn't probably be here today. But just to show that maybe one level of difference is the level of power and freedom that we give to participants in our game. But it comes at a cost and at a price, and we'll discuss that later. Okay, so let's move to the second part, or how such games work in practice and how they can be used for public policy design and support. One thing to remember, our games do not predict future events. They are not meant for that. What they are meant for is to share and confront perceptions, grasp complexity of the system and disentangle complexity, highlight forces and drivers that move the system in one direction or the other. You can connect the short-term and long-term impact, and you can also connect local and global scales. You can also explore alternative futures in a low-risk environment. And Paul talked earlier about first, do no harm. In our games, actually, you can cut all the trees, or you can use pesticides full on. If you're not satisfied, we start again. We replace the board as it was at the beginning, and we try again. And you can negotiate new forms of collective action. So it's really about understanding the variable, the causes, and the effect that are impacting our decision, and in hoping to do today make better informed decision, basically. Enough talking. If you've never been part of such an experiment, let me quickly take you through one in less than 1 minute. Normally they last around 3 hours. So here what you can see at the moment is just green hexagon, different level of green. You see wooden tokens. You see pawns, but you probably have no clue what this game is about, and because it's too abstract, until I tell you that it's actually, and I hope the video will start, yes, it's a landscape, an allegory of a landscape, actually. And what you are seeing is the allegory of the tropical forest of the Congo Basin. People around this table are embodying roles of CEOs of logging and mining companies. They interact with the markets, the government, NGOs, and they design their strategies and shape the environmental, economic, and social landscape based on their individual and collective decision. And here they played 5 rounds, which represent 50 years in time, and players experience all the major drivers of land use change in the tropic. So I've shown you already a few peeks of what our games look like. I've claimed they can be useful for policy design, and usually at this stage, if you've never been part of such experiment, you start frowning your head and asking yourself, but seriously, how such a game can be useful, considering they are so unrealistic looking. And by the way, through this presentation, since we are the last one, I will already integrate the frequently asked questions, so you can rush to the apéro straight after. So the first question that we always have is, how realistic are your games? Well, realism seems a desirable attribute for any model designed to help decision making. And the question is really not new. Maybe you're familiar with the seminal work by Levins in the 66, where it said basically, you can't have it all. You can't have realism, generosity, and precision at the same time. Well, here by realism, we need to clarify what we mean. If we mean that the outputs of the model accurately describe real-life outcomes, yeah, definitely our game sessions are not realistic. The landscape that you saw before with the green and yellow patches is not describing per se the amount of forest and the state they are left in the Congo Basin. But if we consider that realism is also about that the fact that the model describes with accuracy the causal links between system components, then maybe yes, we can say our game are realist. And we are definitely around this line with our approach. But as I said, we want this necessary and voluntary step aside from reality. And why is that? It's because one of the major difficulty when dealing with wicked problem is probably not so much understanding the biophysical processes, but rather the values held by the stakeholders, the segmented perception of the system, their agenda, so quite often hidden, and also the power and knowledge asymmetries. And precisely because a game session involves people, two major components of decision-making are constitutive to the model, the fact that we are facing bounded rationality, we are not homo economicus rational, and behavioral plasticity. We respond and learn and cope when receiving feedback. And in game session, you have direct feedbacks. You see the consequences of your interaction with the system and with others. So the notion of realism always triggers the next frequently asked question, which is realism of game behavior. Sophie this morning in a presentation, she had, do students behave like farmers? In our case, is do farmers behave like farmers? So how do we ensure people behave in the game like in reality? Well, maybe Oscar Wilde would have answered, man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth. Replace mask by role and you have our answer. So how much trust can we place on the observation during the game session? The short and provocative answer would be none. The long answer would be we place equal trust as in responses to surveys and questionnaires, with all the cognitive bias that are associated to it. And the former presentation talked a lot about that. So for us, really, the question is, what happens if people play this way in the game? When I say we don't care, it's not true. We care about this relationship, this distance, this delta between relation with the reality and the game. And for that, as I said, we need debriefing. And that's where serious is critical. We need serious debriefing to explore this relationship. It's an essential step for people to reflect on the experience they just had in the game. But ultimately, does it really matter if players act in the game in ways they would never do in the field? Well, this is precisely what we seek to achieve after all. It's innovation, thinking outside the box, creativity, and the exploration of possible futures beyond one can think can happen. Okay, after the question of realism of the model, realism of the game behavior, the next one in line that you're probably asking yourself is, well, okay, fair enough, that's fun, your little tools, but you will never get ministers playing your game. Ministers or powerful people or important people. Well, actually, that's not true. We managed to have people playing the game. But it's true that unlike in military games or business games where it's really part of their daily activity, in environmental problems where games are still facing this kind of prejudice. Many people associate games with leisure, like our master students still playing, rather than serious activities. And of course, when you join such experiment, you face reputational risk. You face difficulties to justify to your superiors, to your donors, to the taxpayers, how you will allocate time and resources. You have many other cultural barriers. And that's why sometimes using serious games is easy. And sometimes we don't even mention serious game. We have all kinds of crazy name of strategical dialogue, blah, blah, blah. I would prefer to call a cat and say it's an experiment using game. Anyway, to come back to the question of minister, well, that's not true. We managed to have important people. Here you see the same game I presented you. You have representatives from the private sector and from NGO playing this game and devising new strategies for FSC. And on the right-hand side, you have former minister from the finance in Cameroon. I will come to this game in a second. So after all this question, the question of change, what do we really learn from such experiment and what does it change? And really tangible change of the approach is very difficult to demonstrate, but we are confronted to the same problem that all research institutions doing research for development face when exhorted to demonstrate impact, because changes in our world nowadays have multiple, complex, and often cryptic causes. So that's where monitoring and evaluation is critical, and it's a core element of the companion modeling approach to claim attribution to new contract, new policy, new infrastructure, or new practices. And now, finally, let me tell you two stories from the field. I could have picked many to discuss this notion of changes. So let's fly to Bhutan, where over 3 years, an international team of French and Bhutanese researchers develop an approach, a companion modeling approach, to tackle long-lasting conflicts between upstream and downstream rice farmers facing a problem of a limited resource to share, in this case, water. And basically, they went through the full process. They co-created a game, And ultimately, they saw institutional innovation and social innovation. There was the creation over 7 watershed management of a resource management committee, and even you see the person on the right picture signing a paper. They adopted a common action plan. So in this case, you can really relate this action to the approach. But one might say, okay, maybe it works at the very local level. It's very hard to upscale such approach. Yeah, true, upscaling is hard. But as a matter of fact, if we come back to my, there's a delay here, exactly. If we come back to my Ministry of Finance that I showed you before, here you see a game we developed in Cameroon about the palm oil supply chain. You've heard about palm oil. You might have had some for breakfast. It's a very polarizing topic like pesticides. And basically, we developed a game with smallholders, with the agro-industry, and with the representative from the government to understand and put the fingers on all the bottlenecks and issues, inefficiencies in the supply chain. Why Cameroon is no longer self-sufficient, why they rely on import, why there is waste throughout the supply chain. Why there is mistrust between the producer, the smallholders, and the agro-industry. And by to the French Ministry of Research at the IUCN last month. And basically what we managed to see is the farmer playing the game discover the role of the role and the power of cooperatives. It helps to join forces. It doesn't work all the time, and the game allows to show all the failures of cooperatives as well, but it helps. And we've seen in the field the new cooperatives being formed, and WWF and the ministry are using the tool to promote the formation of cooperatives. We've also witnessed new prices and payment mechanism between the actors in the supply chain, and new contracts between the smallholders and the agro-industry. So now I give you back the floor for the last part to see how such approach could be used for the FAST project.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much. The time is over, but I will just go.
5
okay,
minutes
5 minutes. Okay, I just try to go quick, just to display to you an overview of our ongoing research in the FAST project. Can we see the slide? Thank you. So we want to use such approach in the case of pesticides in France. And this will be done in the FAST project that is founded by the PPR. And our aim is to contribute to the public policy toolbox via a serious game. Our outcomes, our expected outcomes is to produce a tool to support dialogue and making converging the stakeholders on this issue in terms of sharing diagnose, to making a more shared diagnose, also to identify pathways to excite. And our second aim is by aggregating learning from game session to produce innovative alternative policy or new organization or strategy that are required to support usual policy instrument. Next slide, please. So how we will do this, as the plan explained by Anne, it's the same. So we will co-construct a consensual model on how it works, how an agricultural landscape works, with the supply chain, the individual, the social pressure, etc., and the biophysical dynamics, indeed the disease. And then we translate this into a model that takes the form of a game that represents a virtual landscape area, a landscape agricultural area. Then we will do many game sessions to gain learnings. Next slide, please. So such pros have challenges, as Anne underlined some of them. The key role, for example, the key role of the manager of the participative interaction is a very important issue that is underlined in many publications. In our case, we have Véronique Souchere, which is online, and which is long and widely experienced in such interaction. Next, please. Click. The second challenge you confronted when you do such approach is that it's very, very important to question the involvement and the relevance of the actors' representatives enrolled in the game design and in the game play. So in our case, we choose to take a real agricultural area as a pilot model for the game co-construction. This region is the region Les Hauts-de-France, which is the French region with the less organic farming, and which is confronted to many phytosanitary impasses. In this region, we have strong partnership with the local community of actors, and we are very in strong cooperation with all the cooperative and input distributor in the region, the extension service and the R&D organization, and the local representative of the agricultural ministry. Next, please click. Thank you. The last challenge that we will be confronted to is that such approach require very, very long timeline. And in our case, we have started the interaction, the transdisciplinary interaction before the project start. And thanks to the PPR features, we will have much time because it is a 6-year project, and this will enable us to do something very interesting with the serious game. And finally, this game will be produced as Creative Commons. So the cooperative with whom we work and other cooperatives for other regions contacted us that they were interested in using such games, and also scholars want to use it in training in, for example, engineer schools. This is an important point that may be interest many of researchers, because in such game we can use it to implement many different policies or instruments that we are from social sciences. And this is an overview of the game as discussed with the stakeholders, and as it may change a little, but this is what we agree with the stakeholders. It will be a virtual agriculture area with different kind of production, with 5 farmers played by real actors, 2 cooperatives played with real actors, an agro-industrial firm, which is a local firm that provide contracts for specific productions, will be played by an external actor, which we can be a researcher. And we have finally a government regulator that is a scripted role. And here we can test many things. We can test taxes, like you say, Alain. We can test rules, new rules, like Ines and Benoit do, or some incentive that other colleagues, that this is, we need to discuss, and maybe we can feed it. And if you don't want to work with us, no problem. We will transfer you. It's a Creative Commons. So in conclusion, with such approach, we hope that more people will be aware of the pesticide exit needs, and on the pathway to this pesticide exit. And in this, we hope also that everyone can contribute to policy making or to support policy that are in use. So by creating a new organization, new contract, new techniques, etc. Finally, serious game is suitable for policy design, as we show. It produces sometimes alternative policies, and sometimes new organizational innovation or new strategies that support usual policy instruments. And in this sense, this approach is complementary to other social science involved in policy making. And thank you very much.
Okay, we have questions online, but
I have a question. Your suggestion, the type of game, the topic, the game you are going to produce in FAST is more or less focused on improving coordination among actors and so on, in order to do what? To change the varieties, the crops, things like that. Do you think it would be possible to build a serious game to co-design or at least to test public policy. I'm thinking about Alain's speech. I would be very interesting to have people around the table trying to design this tax and compensation system in details, because I'm seeing that in details. Do you think it would be possible?
In our game, as expected, we will have different varieties. Resistant varieties, sensible varieties. So it will feed the logic of use of genetic resistance. We will use also pesticide and biopesticide. So we can test something that, okay, now there is new rules, there is a tax. The one who use sensible or biopesticide are tax-free, and the other have to major tax.
Was I think it's very much agronomic oriented. You are testing new agroecological or agronomic solution, whereas we can imagine games to test policy options, to try to define what is the best policy combination.
But as Anne underlined it, this is what I said now is the input of the game. Then we will see how the players react, how they discuss, then we debrief with them. And here is the major learning. What was the impact of this tax? What was good? What is need to change? How can we do in other ways? And this debriefing is the real substance of the learning, I guess. Anne, you may complete if you.
Yeah, No, I was about to say that all these taxes or policy mechanisms can be seen as scenarios in our game. And if they don't emerge from players, we say at round 3, oh, now this is new taxes, it will work like that. Let's try it. Let's see how it impacts on the system.
It's too late, and I think that now I understand your question. The scenario of the taxes or the policies that we will be scripted is not done yet. We discuss with players. They said, okay, let's discuss now about the biophysical and the organizational features, but I think that we need, and we are open to discuss with the researcher or practitioner, lawyers, to construct the scripts. We have in our interaction and co-construction the draft, but I think that we can get interaction with other people from the ministry and other researchers.
Okay, there is some question online. So there is a question, maybe Anne, you can answer directly to Eduardo about the use of ABM software like CoreMass. I don't know if everyone is interested like this, but Eduardo has another question about the evidence of strengthening agri-environmental governments through companion modeling approach. What kind of evidence do you have?
So I can answer also the other one on generalization of model. Agri-environmental governance, this is the first time I'm personally involved in such topic. I would have to consult. I can't answer honestly here and tell you in this experiment they changed this or that. I would have to look into the Commode website.
Question from the online people. It is from Yves Coquet. What will be the main objectives of the serious game? Reaching a no pesticide territory or finding ways to reduce pesticide use? The main objective, is it to reach a no pesticide territory? Is it to find an agreement among researchers, I guess, to have a no pesticide territory? Or is it to find ways? I don't know what he means by ways. Is it policies or is it
our is to support a paradigm shift. This is the first step. I think that if people try to reflect on the landscape, not on just their individual and their farm, if they look to a long-term actions and reactions, something like this, really it's a change of mindset that we want. then if this paradigm shift is reached, I think we will find a lot of solutions. So we don't, the game will be appropriated by the actors, and they will find a way if they appropriate it well. And if it is well designed, I think they will find ways. And in our case, in the Hauts-de-France, they are open. They say, okay, maybe under some constraint, we have to discuss together, but maybe we can develop organic farming. So something like, there will be an impact, a local impact, but our target for us is to get a tools for paradigm shift. Thank you.
Okay. Christian?
Thank you very much for Alain and Mourad for this presentation. I look forward to play with you. I have two questions. The first one is how you take on board, especially in the example of in Hauts-de-France, the downstream sector. So what are the degrees of freedom in the production you want to get access to? There are plenty of processing industry up there. So are you going to carry on producing exactly what they expect, or they are ready to move away? So this was the first thing. And the second is, I do not see how you take on board the uncertainty, because this is what is really tricky, is I do something correct and I don't know whether it's going to be okay. So that's why pesticide is so nice. So how do you take on board this uncertainty? Are you going to tackle the insurance system? And also, how do you, in the serious game more generally, include the complexity? This was also something that Alain pointed out, is how to avoid an usine à gaz. It's a new English word. And, and raised by Alain, so you will have to pay taxes to him. And anyway, property rights. But in fact, a serious game, you tend to make things that are simple. And the problem we have is that we try to move from a system that is simple to a system that is awfully complex. And how you can, during a serious game, tackle seriously this question?
The first about the downstream, we have discussed with actors, local actors downstream. We find that in the rationale, there are two kinds of production that is not with local industrial and with a certain standard that goes everywhere in the world. And the local industry, there's Bonduelle, there is McCain. So we will do a firm that will be maybe Chips & Co. or something like this, and that will use the same tools that the actual industrial will use. And we want to invite this industrial to get and to enrich in second time this lover. Maybe they can find other contract or something like this. But for the now, because there is some issue power between farmers, cooperatives, and this industrial, we choose to let it, okay, now we have to talk about agronomy and epidemiology, so we will go back to you when we discuss contract, and we will do this. So this is very important to get, because our aim is, as Alain said, to connect the downstream and the upstream. Okay. The second things about uncertainties. And maybe you want to respond, but just a few words to let you, before shifting to you. There are some spatial effects about using resistance gene, about using pesticide and biopesticide. If everyone uses the same solutions, there is a loss. And in the same time, some solution, it's what is agronomic or choice of the product, there is the reverse. In the case, if many people choose these solutions, okay, so what we want is that people reflect at the big picture, not just at their farm. And this is, we guess, something that will reduce the uncertainties, not putting it at the zero, but collectively we can reduce it. So maybe Anne, you want to complete on the uncertainties?
And again, I talked about the individual decision that people take in the game, but through the scenarios, quite often we implement scenarios like climate change. Players have to experience a drought or a flood, or in our case, resistance dropping, for example. And this kind of uncertainty we can introduce in the game. Now, the thing we don't know, we can't. There's a thing we know will happen, we don't know how they will happen, we can play with that. The thing we don't know, no, impossible. And as Eduardo mentioned in the game, in the chat, when the game mechanism, especially the biophysical components, are becoming too complex, that's where we blend role-playing game with agent-based model to have in the background all these modeling parts. Now, to answer the simplicity, the topic of palm oil in Cameroon or the water management in Bhutan were not simple problems, and they were as complex as the pesticides. And the game we developed were not simple at all. The difficulty for us is to strike the balance between kids and keep it simple and stupid, and keep it difficult and stupid, kids and kids games model, sorry. Strike the balance to find the core element that will be enough to foster this dialogue. And we don't have the recipe. It's a trial and error all the time. That's why our models are co-constructed.
Thank you. May I complete? I think that our best guarantee to avoid Nusina gas is the multi-stakeholders. Because when researchers say, okay, it will be fine to do this, other stakeholders say, keep calm, keep calm. And sometimes it's a cooperative, sometimes it's a farmer. But together, we avoid. We want to act. We want something usable and utile. Thank you.
Thank you to all of us, for the ones that are still online and the one in this room. So we'll be back tomorrow morning.
Yeah, that's sorry for those that did not get an answer to their question.
Okay, we'll be back tomorrow at 9, exactly 9, because we have the speech of Robert Finger that is planned at 9. And there are some questions in the chat or in the that didn't receive answers. So maybe Anne, you can read the question and answer directly, I think, in the chat, at least for this speech like this. Okay, have a good evening, have a good night, and see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you.